Hey everyone, tonight we travel not just through space but deep into time. You find yourself standing on a windswept plateau in the Andean highlands, thousands of feet above the sea. The air is so thin and sharp it feels like breathing tiny shards of glass. Peaks claw at a cobalt blue sky around you, their jagged edges softened only by the eternal silence. Your fleece and modern hiking boots are gone. Instead, you're wrapped in woven llama wool, the distinct earthy scent clinging to the fabric. You probably wouldn't survive this for more than a few days, let's be honest. Altitude sickness alone would likely send you crawling back to sea level looking for an ibuprofen and a flat white. This is a world without such comforts. It's a world of stark beauty and profound hardship. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you were listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where our journeys begin. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes adjust to the dim light of a small adobe hut. The only warmth comes from a small hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the packed earth walls. In the corner, hunched over a low wooden table, is an old man. He is not a king, nor a famous warrior. He is someone far more interesting. His name is Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, and at this moment he is history's most determined complainant. You watch him work by the flickering light of a tallow lamp. He's probably in his 60s, maybe even his 70s, an ancient age for this time and place, the turn of the 17th century. His face is a roadmap of his life, etched with the deep lines of sun, wind, and worry. He is an indigenous Andean man, a native of this land, yet he wears a slightly threadbare Spanish-style doublet over his traditional tunic. His name itself tells his story. Felipe, a Christian name given at baptism, and Guaman Poma, Quechua for falcon puma, a name that speaks of a noble, pre-conquest lineage. He is a man caught between two tectonic plates of culture, and he feels the grinding pressure every single day. With a focused intensity, he dips a simple reed pen into a pot of black ink, its recipe a secret of soot and binders. He isn't writing on fine parchment but on rough, expensive European paper that he has somehow acquired. Each stroke is deliberate, careful. He is not just writing words, he is drawing. He sketches figures with a surprising vitality, emperors in their litters, farmers in their fields, officials administering justice. You can almost hear the soft scratch of the nib on the page, the only sound besides his own quiet breathing and the distant cry of a night bird. He is compiling a document of staggering ambition. It is a letter. Perhaps the longest and most detailed letter ever written to a monarch. His intended recipient is King Philip III of Spain, a man half a world away, cocooned in the unimaginable luxury of the Escorial Palace. Guaman Poma is convinced that if the king could only see, could only understand what has happened to his people and his world, he would intervene. It's a touching, almost naive faith in the power of a single, well-argued complaint. Basically, he has creating the 17th century equivalent of an email to corporate headquarters that is so long, so detailed, and has so many attachments that the server crashes. To understand his unique position, you need to understand the world he was born into. The Spanish conquest led by Francisco Pizarro had shattered the Inca Empire in the 1530s, decades before Guaman Poma was even born. He grew up in the aftermath, a world where the old certainties were gone, replaced by a new and often brutal colonial administration. But Guaman Poma wasn't just any conquered subject. Here's a little tidbit you might not know. He claimed direct descent from the Yarovilca dynasty, a line of powerful provincial kings who ruled the Huánuco region long before the Incas rose to dominance and absorbed them. This is crucial. In his own eyes, he wasn't just a commoner complaining about taxes. He was a displaced nobleman, a lord of the land, addressing a fellow monarch, albeit a much more powerful one, about the mismanagement of his ancestral domain. He sees the Spanish not as divine conquerors, but as profoundly incompetent and corrupt administrators who have broken everything they've touched. He works tirelessly year after year, traveling the length of the former empire on foot, a journey of thousands of miles. He acts as an interpreter, a legal assistant, a witness. He interviews elders who remember life before the Spanish, and he documents the abuses of the colonial priests, miners, and magistrates he meets along the way. He is a researcher, an artist, a historian, and a legal petitioner all in one. Historians still argue whether his ultimate goal was the selfless liberation of his people or a more personal quest to have his own noble status and lands restored by the Spanish crown. Was he a saintly activist or a savvy politician playing the long game? Perhaps, like most people, he was a complex mixture of both. He saw the suffering of his community as inseparable from the injustice done to his own family line. For him, restoring the proper order of the world, a good government, would naturally mean restoring his family to their rightful place within it. It is a classic case of what is good for me is good for everyone, and he's not entirely wrong. As you watch him add another careful line to a drawing of a corrupt official weighing gold, you realize you are witnessing the birth of one of history's most profound and personal acts of testimony, a message in a bottle thrown into the vast ocean of colonial bureaucracy. You lean closer, drawn in by the sheer gravity of his work. The manuscript lies open on the table, and you can see that it is not one document but a massive collection of pages bound together into a single formidable volume. This is the El Primer Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, the first new chronicle and good government. It's a title that is both a declaration and a demand. New chronicle because he is correcting the histories written by the Spaniards, histories that he feels are full of lies, misunderstandings, and self-serving justifications. He is offering the true story. And good government because this is not just a history lesson. It's a detailed 1,000-page proposal for how to fix the broken colonial system and create a just society. It's an instruction manual for ruling the Andes correctly, submitted by a man who believes the current management is running the entire enterprise into the ground. The book itself is a testament to his dedication. It's nearly 200 pages long. Imagine that. In an age without typewriters or printers, he has written and illustrated every single page by hand. You can almost feel the weight of it, the dense stack of paper representing decades of his life. You can smell the faint, musty scent of the rag paper and the sharp, carbon-based ink. Flipping through its pages would be a journey in itself. His handwriting is a curious, looping script, mostly in Spanish, but it's a Spanish that breathes with the rhythm of the Andes. It's riddled with words and phrases from his native Quechua and even Aymara, another major indigenous language. Sometimes he'll just drop a Quechua word in mid-sentence because there is no Spanish equivalent that captures the precise meaning he intends. This creates a unique linguistic tapestry that scholars now find invaluable, a perfect reflection of his own hybrid identity. It is like reading an official report written by someone who can help but code switch into their mother tongue. It's authentic, it's messy, and it's beautifully human. But the words, as dense and important as they are not what first sees your attention. It's the drawings. The manuscript contains 398 full-page illustrations, one for nearly every major idea he presents. And these are not just decorative doodles. They are the heart of his argument. Guaman Poma was a gifted artist, but not in the European tradition of Renaissance masters. His style is direct, bold, and deceptively simple. The figures are often flat, the perspective a little strange, but they are packed with information and raw emotional power. He uses them to show you things he knows words alone cannot convey, especially to a king an ocean away. He draws the Inca emperors in all their finery, the orderly storehouses of the empire, the farmers joyfully celebrating the harvest. Then, with the same pen, he draws Spanish officials whipping native workers, priests growing fat on stolen goods, and the chaos and despair of the colonial world. Each drawing is a window, a snapshot. It's a 17th century PowerPoint presentation designed to shock a distant CEO into action. He was, in essence, history's first great infographic artist. You wonder about his plan. Once this monumental work is finished, how does he get it into the hands of King Philip III? There's no international postal service, no FedEx to ship this precious cargo. He would have to entrust it to someone traveling to Spain, a sympathetic bishop perhaps, or a colonial official returning to court. You can picture him, an old man, handing over his life's work, a bundle heavier than its physical weight, and praying it survives the perilous journey across the mountains. The ports teeming with pirates and the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. It's a logistical nightmare, hoping this one-of-a-kind document doesn't get water damaged, eaten by rats in a ship's hold, or simply tossed aside by a bureaucrat in Seville. The whole enterprise is a breathtaking leap of faith. A quirky detail you notice as you imagine flipping through the pages is his idiosyncratic spelling. He often spelled Spanish words phonetically, the way he heard them spoken with a regional Andean accent. For linguists, this is a goldmine, offering clues to the pronunciation of the time, but it also adds to the charm of the work. It feels less like a polished official document and more like an earnest personal testimony. He wasn't some court-trained scribe. He was a man of the provinces, writing what he knew, the way he knew how to write it. Historians still argue whether the visual component of the Nueva Coronica was its primary weapon. Did Guaman Poma suspect the king, or his advisors, would never read all 200 pages of dense text, and therefore made the drawings the main vehicle for his message, a kind of executive summary in pictures? Or were the drawings intended merely as illustrations to guide the reader through his complex legal and theological arguments? It's the ultimate 17th century TL/DR debate. Looking at the power of the images, you suspect he knew a picture was worth 1,000 words, especially when those words were in a slightly strange dialect of Spanish and your target audience was a monarch with a notoriously short attention span. Through this book, this incredible letter, he is about to take you on a tour of his world, starting with the one that was lost. Guaman Poma's ink-stained finger guides your eye across one of his hand-drawn maps. It's not a map in the way you understand it, with precise longitudes and latitudes. It's a diagram of a worldview, an organizational chart of the cosmos. He is showing you the world that was, the great empire he calls the Tawantinsuyu. The name itself in Quechua is the entire concept in a nutshell. Tawa means four, and Ntien means together or a group, while Suyu means region or quarter. It is, quite literally, the four parts together. It's a name that speaks of unity, of a deliberate and sacred geometry imposed upon a vast and wild landscape. He wants King Philip to understand that this was not a random collection of tribes, but a single, coherent body politic, a sprawling state that stretched for nearly 3,000 miles along the spine of the Andes. At the very center of his drawing, the point from which all lines radiate, is the capital city of Cusco. For the Inca, Cusco wasn't just a political capital. It was the sacred navel of the universe, the Cusco. This is the mainstream historical fact that forms the bedrock of their imperial identity. From the central plaza, four great roads shot out towards the cardinal directions, each one leading to one of the four great quarters of the empire. It's the ultimate celestial roundabout, and you'd better signal your intentions correctly. Guaman Poma draws the Sapa Inca, the emperor, seated on a throne right at this central point, the pivot around which the entire world turns. You are looking at an empire conceived as a perfect four-quadrant grid, an expression of cosmic order on Earth. The first and most prestigious quarter to the north was Chinchaysuyu. This was the wealthiest region, encompassing the sophisticated cultures of the northern Peruvian coast and extending into modern-day Ecuador and Colombia. It was a land of skilled artisans, powerful merchants, and fertile valleys. Guaman Poma depicts its people as clever and refined. To the east lay Antisuyu, the mysterious and wild jungle region that sloped down into the Amazon basin. This was a land of coca leaves, exotic bird feathers for ceremonial dress, and powerful shamanic knowledge. It was also a formidable natural barrier. The Inca armies could conquer mountains, but even they knew better than to march too deep into a jungle that viewed outsiders as a mobile buffet. The smallest quarter was Kuntisuyu, the dry coastal region to the southwest, important for its access to the sea and its resources. And finally, there was the largest and most populous of the four quarters, Kulasuyu, stretching south across the high windswept plateau of the Altiplano through modern Bolivia and into parts of Chile and Argentina. This was the empire's heartland in terms of raw resources, the land of countless llamas and alpacas that provided wool, meat, and transport, and home to the massive silver mine at Potosí that would later become the engine of the Spanish colonial economy. Guaman in his chronicle, carefully lists the different peoples and resources of each Suyu, painting a picture of a diverse yet integrated whole. He is showing the Spanish king that this wasn't an empty wilderness they had stumbled upon. It was a complex functioning state with a sophisticated understanding of its own geography and demography. But was this great union of 4 parts a voluntary one? That's where things get more complicated. You notice that Guaman, while celebrating the order of the Inca system, is careful to identify himself and his own people as belonging to a lineage that predated the Inca conquest of his homeland. This brings us to a major point of scholarly contention. Historians still argue whether the Tawantinsuyu was a truly integrated empire, a sort of Andean-European union built on mutual benefit and cultural exchange, or if it was more like a tense collection of recently conquered territories, all paying tribute to a powerful overlord under duress. Some Spanish chroniclers, especially those of Inca noble descent like Garcilaso de la Vega, painted a rosy picture of benevolent expansion. But archaeological evidence and testimonies like Guaman suggest a more forceful reality. For many of the peoples absorbed into the Tawantinsuyu, it was a bit like a corporate merger where your company is bought out. You get a new logo and a new mission statement, but you're still quietly grumbling about the old boss in the break room. Guaman as quirky tidbit here is his insistence on mapping this Andean worldview onto a Christian one for the king-ass benefit. He draws a world map, a mappa mundi, but he places the Indies, his world, at the very top, directly under God the Father, with Europe and the rest of the world relegated to a lower status. It's a bold, almost subversive act. He is using the tools of his colonizers to recenter the world, placing his own people at the heart of the divine plan. He's arguing that the Tawantinsuyu wasn't just a political entity, but a divinely ordered society, a near-perfect structure that the Spanish had failed to comprehend. Before he can show you how the Spanish broke this magnificent machine, he first has to show you just how ancient and deep its foundations really are, reaching back into the mists of time, long before the first Inca ever wore a crown. He turns the page. You see now that his meticulous map of the Tawantinsuyu, that grand vision of ordered space, is just the final chapter of a much, much older story. To truly make the Spanish king understand the magnitude of what has been lost, Guaman knows he must establish its legitimacy not just in space but in the deep currents of time. He can't just present the Inca Empire as a recent political creation. He has to frame it as the culmination of a divine plan, a history as ancient and profound as the biblical narrative the Spanish hold so dear. So, he takes you back, way back. Before the Inca, before the great stone cities, to the very dawn of humanity in the Andes, he presents a history of the world divided into ages, a concept that would have been familiar to his European readers, who understood history through the lens of the ages of man, from classical mythology or the epochs of the Bible. He begins with the first age of the Indians, the Wari Wirakucha Runa, the people of the god Viracocha. His drawing for this section is startling. It depicts a man and a woman completely unclothed standing in a rugged landscape. You might as well be looking at an Andean Adam and Eve, and that's precisely the point. This is a mainstream historical fact about his work. Guaman deliberately synchronizes Andean and biblical history. He argues that the indigenous peoples of the Andes are also descendants of Adam and Eve, that they were part of God's original creation. In his telling, these first people were simple and pure. They didn't know how to weave clothes, so they wore leaves. They didn't know how to build houses, so they lived in caves and rock shelters. Their diet was what you might call extreme paleo. They ate wild herbs and grasses and drank from springs. No gluten-free bread, no artisanal cheese, just whatever they could forage. But they were good. They recognized the one true creator God, whom they called Viracocha, and they lived in peace, multiplying across the land. Then comes the second age, the Wari Runa, or wild people. His drawing shows them taking the first steps towards civilization. They've come out of the caves and have learned to build simple, conical huts called pukulos. They've figured out basic agriculture, tilling the earth with simple foot plows. Crucially, they've learned to weave textiles from plant fibers, and later, llama wool. They've gone from wearing fig leaves to functional, if not exactly fashionable, tunics. You see them as a gentle, pastoral people, spreading across the mountains and valleys. They were, in his words, a humble people who still worshipped God and lived according to simple laws. This age, he claims, ended with the Great Flood from the Bible, and here you find a truly quirky tidbit. Guaman Poma posits that some of the Andean peoples survived the flood, not necessarily on Noah's Ark, but because they were part of God's grander plan. He's essentially trying to find a parking spot for Noah's Ark in the Andes, creatively retrofitting his local history into the global biblical narrative. The third age is the Puran Runa, the people of the wilderness. Now things get more complex and a bit more human. Society is organizing. His drawings show people living in larger settlements. They have leaders, they mine for gold and silver, and they have developed more sophisticated weaving and pottery. They have spread to every corner of the Andes, but with complexity comes conflict. The seeds of war and idolatry are sown in this age. They begin to worship not just the creator God, but also local deities, spirits of the mountains and streams, the Huacas. It is the beginning of a spiritual decline that mirrors humanity. His fall from grace in the Old Testament. This decline leads directly to the fourth age, the blood-soaked Alcaruna, the age of warriors. His drawings for this period are grim. You see villages transformed into heavily fortified hilltop fortresses, called pucaras. Warriors clash with clubs and slings. It is a time of chaos, a brutal free-for-all where might makes right. Life is short, and fear is constant. It is an Andean dark age, a world that has lost its moral and social compass. And this is the setup for his masterstroke. This is the broken world into which the Incas will arrive. Why construct this elaborate four-act play of history? This is where a fascinating debate emerges. Historians still argue whether Guaman Poma was presenting a genuine syncretic faith, a heartfelt belief that Andean history and Christian scripture were two versions of the same divine story, or if he was executing a brilliant legal and rhetorical strategy. By claiming his people were part of biblical creation and had a direct, if forgotten, relationship with the Christian God long before the Spanish arrived, he completely demolishes the religious justification for the conquest. The Spanish claimed they were bringing salvation to heathens, but Poma argues, "We knew God all along. You just showed up late to the party and broke everything." He is establishing a claim of spiritual and historical legitimacy that equals, if not surpasses, that of the Europeans. By the time you reach the end of the Fourth Age, you see the world as he wants you to see it. A land crying out for order, for a unifying force to end the chaos. And right on cue, onto this stage walks the first Inca, the founder of the fifth and greatest age of man. The page turns, and the chaos of the Alcaruna, the age of warriors, recedes. Out of that violent, fractured world, Guaman Poma introduces the organizing principle, the divine hand that will bring order. You are introduced to the fifth age of man, the age of the Incas. And at its heart, seated on a golden stool called a tiana, is the figure of the Sapa Inca. This is not just a king. In the Andean worldview, he is the literal son of the sun, a living deity walking the earth. His full title, Sapa Inca, means the only Inca, or the unique Inca, a title that brooks no rivals. Guaman Poma's drawings depict him with an almost iconic simplicity. A noble profile, large ear spools stretching his lobes as a sign of his high status, and on his forehead the mascai pacha, a ceremonial fringe of red tassels that was the Inca equivalent of a crown. This was the symbol of absolute power. You watch his day begin. He doesn't just roll out of bed. He is awakened by attendants in a chamber adorned with the finest textiles and shimmering gold. He never wears the same clothes twice. Each day, a new set of exquisitely woven garments made from the silky fleece of the vicuña is brought to him. The previous day's outfit is carefully stored away to be ceremonially burned at the end of the year. This is a mainstream historical fact that underscores his sacred status. His mortal essence could not be left lying around. He eats from gold and silver plates which are held for him by attendants. The food is brought into his presence for his inspection, and he indicates what he wishes to eat. He never touches the plates himself. Anything he points to is served to him in small portions. He is a being set apart, insulated from the mundane realities of the world. Imagine if your used paper plate from a picnic was treated as a sacred object requiring a state-level ritual for its disposal. It's that level of reverence, turned up to 11. When he moves through his capital, Cusco, or travels his empire, he never walks. Guaman provides one of his most famous and detailed illustrations, the Sapa Inca in his royal litter, or rampa. You see him seated high above the crowd on a magnificent platform, surrounded by a canopy of brilliant parrot feathers. The litter itself is adorned with sheets of gold and silver. It is carried on the shoulders of dozens of the highest-ranking nobles from specific ethnic groups, an immense honor for which they trained their entire lives. To drop the Sapa Inca was a death sentence not just for the bearers, but potentially for their entire families and villages. Ahead of the procession, attendants sweep the very road he will travel over, removing every small stone and piece of straw. His feet must never touch the common ground. As he passes, his subjects, even local lords and chieftains, avert their eyes. To look directly upon the face of the Son of the Sun was a sacrilege, an act of profound disrespect punishable by death. This divine status was reinforced by his marriage. The Sapa Inca's principal wife, the queen or Koya, was traditionally his own full sister. While this practice of royal incest was horrifying to the Spanish, it had a powerful internal logic for the Inca. If the Sapa Inca was the son of the sun, his consort had to be of equally pure divine blood, a daughter of the moon. The only way to guarantee this purity was to marry within the immediate celestial family. This kept the divine bloodline undiluted and distinct from all other noble lineages in the empire. It was cosmic nepotism on a grand scale. Of course, with such absolute power came absolute responsibility. The Sapa Inca was the state. He was the final court of appeals, the commander-in-chief of the armies, and the chief legislator. From his throne in Cusco, he oversaw a vast bureaucracy that managed everything from crop yields to census data. He was kept informed by a constant stream of messengers, the fleet-footed chasqui, who relayed information across the empire. But this leads to a critical point of contention. Historians still argue whether the transfer of this immense power was a stable, predictable process. While in theory, the Sapa Inca chose his most competent son to succeed him, not necessarily the eldest, in practice, his death often triggered a brutal power vacuum. Ambitious sons, backed by different noble factions or influential mothers from the harem, would frequently plunge the empire into a vicious civil war to claim the Scarlet Fringe. It was less a primogeniture system and more of a royal battle royale. This is precisely the information Guaman needs the King of Spain to absorb. He is illustrating a model of perfect, centralized authority. He shows a ruler who is not just a political leader but the living embodiment of social and cosmic order. The subtext is clear. He is contrasting the sacred, meticulous, and all-encompassing rule of the Sapa Inca with the chaotic, greedy, and often incompetent governance of the Spanish viceroys and local magistrates. He's saying, look at this perfect system of command and control. This is the order you shattered. Before you can even begin to grasp the laws or the economy of this vast empire, you have to understand the single, divine point from which all power flows. It is from this sacred figure on his golden stool that the entire social structure of the Tawantinsuyu emanates, right down to the humblest family unit tilling a potato field on a remote mountainside. From the gilded, solitary peak of the Sapa Inca's divine authority, you now descend into the valleys, right down to the fertile soil of the Andean terraces. The empire, for all its celestial leadership, was built not on gold, but on the accumulated labor of millions, organized into a single fundamental building block. Guaman turns the page again, and his drawing shifts from emperors to commoners. You are now looking at the cellular level of the Tawantinsuyu, the Ailu. This is the engine room of the empire, the foundation upon which everything else rests. The Ailu is not a nuclear family, not just a mom, a dad, and 2.5 kids. It's an extended kinship group, a clan. Think of it as a small village or a neighborhood where everyone is related, or at least believes they are. The members of an ALU all trace their lineage back to a common ancestor. This ancestor isn't always a human being. This is a quirky and fascinating aspect of Andean spirituality. The ancestor could be a mythical hero, but it could also be a physical feature of the landscape. Your ALU might have originated from a specific mountain peak, APU, a mysterious cave, or a sacred spring. This place is known as the Pacarina, the place of origin. This belief forged an unbreakable bond between the people and the very land they inhabited. They didn't just live on the land, they were from it. Their identity was written into the geography around them. When a member of the ALU looked at that mountain, they didn't just see a pile of rock. They saw Grandpa. This spiritual connection is something Guaman Poma is desperate to convey. A stark contrast to the Spanish view of land as a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited. In his drawing, you see the members of an ALU working together in a field. Men are breaking the hard soil with a chaquitacla, a uniquely Andean tool. It's a foot plow, a long wooden pole with a handle, a footrest, and a sharp point. They work in teams, stepping on the footrest to drive the point into the earth and then pulling back to turn the sod. It's a rhythmic, coordinated effort. Following them are the women, who drop potato or quinoa seeds into the furrows and cover them with soil. Children are there too, shooing away birds or carrying water. This is not individual farming. It is a collective enterprise. This communal work ethic is codified in two central concepts: a mainstream historical fact that explains how Andean society functioned for centuries, Aini and Minka. Aini is the principle of reciprocity. It's the idea of today for you, tomorrow for me. If your family needs help harvesting your field, your neighbors from the ALU will come and help you. It's not a transaction for money, it's a social obligation. You are now in their debt, and when their roof needs repairing or their harvest comes in, you are expected to be there, no questions asked. It's a system of mutual support that ensures no single family fails. Minka, on the other hand, is when the entire ALU is called to work on a project that benefits everyone, like maintaining the complex irrigation canals that water the terraces or building a new communal storehouse. It's a barn raising on a massive scale. The land itself wasn't owned by individuals. It was held collectively by the ALU, though ultimately it all belonged to the Sapa Inca. Each year, the ALU's land was reportioned out to the individual families by the local leader, the Caraca. The size of your plot, your tupu, depended on the size of your family. A larger family with more mouths to feed and more hands to work would receive a larger plot. When your family grew or shrank, your allotment would be adjusted. This system ensured a basic level of fairness and prevented the kind of generational poverty that comes from families losing their land. This is the social harmony Guaman Poma celebrates. He depicts a world without beggars, a society where everyone has a right to land and the support of their community. But how did this ancient system interact with the newer imperial power of the Inca? Here a lively debate continues. Historians still argue whether the ALU was a pre-Incaic institution that the empire skillfully co-opted, or if its structure was fundamentally reshaped and standardized by the Inca state to facilitate control. The evidence suggests it was probably a bit of both. The Inca state was brilliant at taking existing local structures and plugging them into their grand imperial schematic. They organized the ALUs into a decimal system, groups of 10, 100, and 1,000 households, for easier administration, census taking, and most importantly for organizing the state's share of their labor. The work of the ALU, you see, wasn't just for their own subsistence. After their own needs were met, they had another obligation, a tax paid not in coin but in time and sweat. You've seen how the ALU functions as a self-sufficient, collaborative unit, a web of reciprocal obligations that keeps the community alive. But that work, the Aini and the Minka, is only part of their duty. Guaman Poma now shows you what happened when the state came calling. He introduces you to the concept of the mita. This word will echo darkly through Andean history, but here in its original Inca context it is presented as something different. It is the labor tax, the cornerstone of the entire imperial economy. The Inca state had little use for money. It had no currency. Its great wealth was its people, or more specifically their time and energy. The Mita was the system for mobilizing that energy on an epic scale. Imagine you are a Hatun Runa, a head of a household, a common man. One day, the local leader, the Kuraka, gathers the men of your Ailu. He has a quipu, a knotted string record, from which he reads the census data. Your turn has come. For the next few months, you are to serve your Mita. This wasn't a punishment. It was a universal civic duty for every able-bodied man, typically between the ages of 25 and 50. It was rotational, so while you were away, the rest of your Ailu, through the system of Aini, would help your family tend your fields. The state didn't want your family to starve, it wanted your focused, uninterrupted labor. What kind of work would you be doing? The possibilities were vast. You might be assigned to agricultural labor, not on your own Ailu land, but on the land set aside for the state and for the religious cult of the sun. The harvest from these lands would fill the great storehouses, the quilcas that lined the Inca highways. This was the empire's social security system, a buffer against famine that could feed the army, the bureaucracy, and the populace in times of drought. A more demanding assignment would be military service. You could be sent to a distant frontier to expand the empire or to a garrison to quell a rebellion. You'd trade your footplow for a war club and a sling, marching for weeks to reach your post. Or, and this is where you see the true genius of the system, you might be assigned to a state construction project. This is the mainstream historical fact that is literally written in stone across the Andes. The Mita system was the engine that built the Tawantinsuyu's monumental infrastructure. You could be one of the thousands of men quarrying and shaping the enormous stones for the fortress of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, fitting them together so perfectly without mortar that you can't slip a knife blade between them. Or you could be tasked with paving a section of the Great Inca Road, or weaving the thick cables of ichu grass for one of the dizzying suspension bridges that spanned mountain gorges. You were a tiny cog in a massive, coordinated machine, a machine that could reshape the landscape itself. Now, while this sounds like a form of corvée labor, there was a crucial element of reciprocity built into the Inca Mita. This is a point Guaman Poma stresses in his drawings. While you worked for the state was obligated to care for you. State warehouses provided you with the tools you needed, the food you ate, and importantly, the chicha, a fermented corn beer you drank. Festivals and ceremonies were often part of the work schedule. The Inca understood a fundamental truth of project management. A fed, watered, and slightly tipsy workforce is a happy and productive workforce. This was a social contract. You gave your labor, and the state provided security, sustenance, and a sense of participation in a grand, cosmic project. This system also allowed for incredible specialization, a quirky tidbit of Inca economic planning. While most men performed general labor, some Elis were designated as specialists. Their maitia was not to build roads, but to practice a specific craft for the state. There were communities of expert weavers who produced the finest textiles for the nobility, villages of potters who made the standardized ceramics for the army, and groups of metallurgists who worked with gold and silver for the temples. Some groups, like the Chumbivilcas, had a particularly unusual duty. Their mite was to serve as dancers and musicians in Cusco, providing entertainment for the Sapa Inca's court. Imagine your entire community's tax obligation being fulfilled by performing the 16th century equivalent of a Vegas residency. This brings us to a central debate. Historians still argue whether the Mita was a generally benevolent system of reciprocal obligation, as Guaman Poma and other pro-Inca chroniclers portray it, or if it was a sophisticated form of state exploitation that systematically drained the life force from its subjects for the benefit of an elite. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, for a farmer sent hundreds of miles from his home to work in a cold, high-altitude mine. It probably felt a lot more like exploitation than a party. But for the man building a temple in his home province, it may have been a source of immense pride. For Guaman Poma, however, there is no ambiguity. He presents the Inca Mita as a model of orderly, productive, and humane public service. And he does this for one simple reason: to create the starkest possible contrast with the Spanish, who would take the shell of this system, strip it of all its reciprocal obligations, and turn it into a truly terrifying instrument of death and destruction. Before you see that corruption, however, you must first travel the greatest single product of this labor, the roads you worked on. The sweat of those Mida laborers, the communal effort you just witnessed, didn't just evaporate into the thin mountain air. It soaked into the earth and solidified into the empire's greatest single achievement. You now step out of the communal fields and onto one of its arteries. You are standing on the great Inca road, the Capac Ñan. The name means the beautiful road, or the royal road, and it is an understatement. This isn't a muddy track worn into the ground by centuries of foot traffic. Where you stand, in the highlands, it is a paved causeway, about 20 feet wide, made of carefully fitted stones. It runs straight as an arrow across the high plain, a declaration of intent carved into the face of the planet. This is not a road, it is a network, a nervous system. The mainstream historical fact about the Capac Ñan is its sheer, staggering scale. It consisted of two main north-south trunks, one running along the spine of the Andes, the other along the arid coast, connected by dozens of smaller east-west roads. All told, it was a system of over 25,000 miles of engineered roadway. To put that in perspective, that's enough road to circle the entire Earth at the equator. The Roman Empire, famous for its roads, built a comparable network, but the Inca did it in a fraction of the time in arguably the most challenging mountain terrain on the planet. And they did it all without the benefit of the wheel-draft animals like oxen or horses or even iron tools. It's a feat of civil engineering that makes your local highway project, with all its delays and budget overruns, look like a toddler playing with mud pies. You begin to walk. The road adapts to the terrain with an almost intelligent grace. On a steep mountainside, it transforms into a grand stone staircase, with thousands of steps climbing towards the sky. In a marshy valley, it becomes a raised stone causeway, lifting you above the soggy ground. But its most breathtaking features are the bridges. The Andes are sliced by deep, raging river canyons. To cross them, Inca engineers perfected the art of the suspension bridge, or puente de soga. Guamanpoma draws these with a terrifying beauty. Imagine standing at the edge of a 1,000-foot drop. In front of you, a bridge made of woven ichu grass sways in the wind. The main cables, as thick as your torso, are anchored to massive stone pylons on either side. The walkway is a mat of smaller ropes and sticks. It sags in the middle, and with every gust of wind, the whole structure groans and shifts. Crossing one is a profound act of faith in ancient engineering. You probably wouldn't make it halfway across without closing your eyes and questioning all your life choices. This incredible network wasn't built for casual tourism. Its primary purpose was to hold the sprawling, diverse empire together. It allowed the Sapa Inca AES armies to move with astonishing speed from one end of the Tawantinsuyu to the other, to quell rebellions or mass on a frontier for a new campaign. It facilitated the movement of goods, with vast llama caravans transporting food, textiles, and pottery between regions. But its most vital function was communication. The empire's internet was made of human legs. Along the roads, spaced every few miles, were small relay stations called tambos. In each tambo waited a team of fresh runners, the legendary Chasqui. Guamanpoma depicts them as young men, lean and powerful, carrying a conch shell trumpet to announce their arrival. A Chasqui would run at top speed to the next tambo, where another runner would be waiting. As they ran alongside each other for a few yards, the message, often in the form of a memorized oral statement or a complex quipu, was passed off. The fresh runner would then sprint to the next station. This relay system operated 24 hours a day, allowing a message to travel up to 150 miles in a single day. And here's a quirky and wonderful tidbit. To keep his energy up, the Chasqui would chew on a wad of coca leaves, the same plant that is the raw ingredient for cocaine. It was a sacred plant, a gift from the gods that numbed hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Thanks to this system, the Sapa Inca in Cusco could dine on fresh fish brought by Chasqui from the Pacific coast, over 300 miles away within 2 days. It's the original one-day delivery service, and the delivery guy is an Olympic-level marathoner. But could you, as a common farmer, just decide to take a stroll down the Capac Ñan to visit your cousin in the next valley? This is a point of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether the Inca Road was a restricted access superhighway for state use only, or if it was open to the general public. Evidence suggests that travel was strictly controlled. Bridges often had toll gates and checkpoints where officials would demand to know your business. Unauthorized travel was a serious offense. However, the roads were also used for religious pilgrimages to major shrines, and it seems unlikely that the state could have completely prevented local people from using sections of the road for their own short-distance travel. For Guaman Poma, the road is a symbol of Inca order and efficiency, a perfectly regulated system. Walking its length, you feel that control. It is a physical manifestation of the state's power, a network that ties every village and every Elu back to the sacred center, back to Cusco. It is the framework for the laws that will now be imposed upon you. The Capac Ñan, this great road you're walking, is more than just a physical connection. It's the conduit for imperial will. Along with troops and goods, it carries something invisible but immensely powerful: the law. As you move from the open plains into a small provincial town, you begin to see how this law is applied. In the central plaza, you see a local official, a curaca, settling a dispute between two farmers over water rights. There are no lawyers arguing technicalities, no endless appeals clogging up the system. The decision is made swiftly, on the spot, based on tradition and the testimony of neighbors. This is the first and most fundamental level of Inca justice. The entire legal and moral framework of the Tawantinsuyu rests on a surprisingly simple and elegant foundation: 3 cardinal rules. This is the mainstream historical fact that every citizen of the empire knew from childhood. They were taught to live by the creed, Ama Sua, Ama Lula, Ama Killa. Don't steal, don't lie, don't be lazy. That's it. That's the whole ball game. It sounds almost childishly simple, like a preschool classroom rule. But for the Inca, these 3 prohibitions covered nearly every conceivable crime. Stealing encompassed everything from petty theft to corruption. Lying covered perjury, slander, and breaking oaths. And laziness, in a society built on the labor tax of the Mita, was a crime against the state itself. To be idle was to steal from the Sapa Inca, to weaken the entire social fabric. Guaman Poma's drawings of the justice system are stark and unambiguous. He shows judges seated on flat-topped platforms, listening intently to cases. He depicts a world of clear-cut guilt and innocence. Punishments, when they came, were designed to be a powerful and very public deterrent. The Inca had little use for prisons in the modern sense. Why waste resources feeding and guarding a criminal for years? Their philosophy was much more direct. Punishments were swift, severe, and almost always carried out in the open for everyone to see. For a minor theft, you might be forced to repay what you stole and then be publicly flogged. For a more serious offense, like repeatedly stealing from the state storehouses, the punishment was often death, and the methods of execution were varied and often grimly tailored to the crime. A common thief might be stoned to death or thrown from a cliff. Traitors, blasphemers, or those who dared to harm the Sapa Inca or one of his chosen women faced a more terrible fate. They might be executed and their bodies left out for scavengers, their bones ground into dust and their homes sown with salt. The message was absolute. You have not only forfeited your life, but your very memory. Even your family might be punished or exiled. A terrifying prospect in the collectivist world of the Elu. It's a bit like getting a parking ticket, but instead of a fine, they tow your car, your house, and your entire extended family. This brings us to a truly quirky aspect of Inca law, the concept of collective responsibility. You weren't just responsible for your own actions, but for the well-being of your community. If a government bridge in your district collapsed due to neglect, the entire local community could be punished for failing in their duty. Guaman Poma illustrates a case where a local administrator is punished for not reporting a crime committed under his jurisdiction. The state essentially told its officials, if a crime happens on your watch and you don't deal with it, then you are the criminal. This top-down accountability was a powerful motivator for local leaders to keep their territories in perfect order. Social harmony wasn't just a nice idea, it was a state-mandated requirement, and the penalties for disrupting it were severe, even for something as simple as gossip, which could be punished by public shaming or flogging. Of course, this raises a profound question, one that scholars still wrestle with. Historians still argue whether Inca justice was truly a system of efficient, incorruptible fairness that created a virtually crime-free society, or if it was a brutal police state that enforced obedience through terror. Pro-Inca chroniclers and Guaman Poma himself paint a picture of an Andean utopia, a land without thieves or vagabonds, where you could leave a pile of gold by the roadside and no one would dare touch it. It's an attractive image, but it likely smooths over a much harsher reality. With no system of appeal, a false accusation could be a death sentence. The law was absolute and mercy was not a prominent feature of the imperial legal code. For Guaman Poma, however, this severity is a virtue. He presents this strict, unyielding system to King Philip as a model of good governance. He wants to show the king a world where the law was respected, where order was paramount, and where officials were held to the highest standards, a world that is the polar opposite of the corrupt, chaotic, and unjust colonial system that has replaced it. Before you can see that broken system, however, you need to understand the economy that this strict justice was designed to protect. That strict, unforgiving justice system you just witnessed wasn't an abstract exercise in social control. It was the security system for the imperial vault. But the great wealth of the Tawantinsuyu wasn't something you could lock away in a chest. It was alive, growing on thousands of hillsides, and it was meticulously tracked on knotted strings. The Inca economy was a marvel of agricultural engineering and centralized planning, a system designed to feed millions in one of the world's harshest environments. It was an economy without money, without markets, and without merchants in the way you'd understand them. You're standing on the edge of a steep mountain valley. Below you, the slope has been transformed into a giant green staircase. These are the Andines, the iconic agricultural terraces of the Andes. This is the mainstream historical fact that underpinned the entire empire. The Inca were masters of high-altitude agriculture. They didn't just farm the valleys. They created new farmland by carving it out of the mountains themselves. Each terrace is a small marvel of engineering, with a stone retaining wall and layers of gravel, sand, and rich topsoil that were carried up from the valley floor. This design prevented erosion and allowed for sophisticated irrigation, turning otherwise unfarmable slopes into productive gardens. And what did they grow? Forget the simple wheat and barley diet of medieval Europe. The Andes were a botanical laboratory. The Inca and their predecessors had domesticated an incredible array of crops. The most important, of course, was the potato. But we're not talking about the 3 or 4 varieties you find at your local supermarket. Here's a quirky tidbit that will make you rethink your fries. Andean farmers cultivated over 3,000 different types of potatoes. There were potatoes for boiling, potatoes for roasting, potatoes of every shape, size, and color imaginable: blue, red, yellow, purple. They even had potatoes specifically adapted for different altitudes, and they developed a genius preservation technique. At night, they would lay the potatoes out on the high, cold plains to freeze. The next day, they would trample them underfoot to squeeze out the water, then leave them to dry in the intense mountain sun. After repeating this process for several days, they were left with a lightweight, freeze-dried potato product called chuño. It was the original astronaut food, and it could be stored for years, even decades, providing a perfect insurance policy against famine. Alongside the potato, they grew quinoa, the superfood of its day, and immense fields of maize or corn, which was used both for food and for making the ubiquitous chicha beer that fueled state labor projects. All this produce, from the state and sun lands worked by Mida labor, flowed into a vast network of state-run storehouses. Guaman Poma draws these kulkas as neat rows of round or square buildings, often built on windy hillsides to keep the contents dry and cool. This was the empire's central bank and supermarket chain rolled into one. From here, the state redistributed the wealth. It fed the army, the bureaucracy, the priests, and the artisans working for the Sapa Inca. It provided for the old, the sick, and the widowed. And in times of crop failure, these stores were opened to the general population. It was a command economy on a breathtaking scale, managed by an army of administrators. Basically, it was the world's most efficient and terrifyingly thorough tax agency. Except instead of taking your money, they took a portion of your potatoes. But how do you manage an empire-wide economy of this complexity without a written language, without spreadsheets, without a single ledger book? You use knots. You are now in the presence of a Quipuca Mayak, a keeper of the knots. He is a highly trained official, an accountant and archivist of the empire. In his hands he holds a quipu. It consists of a main cord from which hang dozens, sometimes hundreds of smaller color-coded pendant strings made of llama or alpaca wool. Tied into these pendant strings are intricate knots. This is the Inca database. The color of the strings could signify the item being counted. Yellow for gold, white for silver, red for warriors. The type of knot and its position on the string indicated a numerical value in a base 10 system. A simple overhand knot might be a 1, a figure 8 knot a 5, and a long knot with multiple turns a 10. With this system, a Quipuca Mayak could record census data, track crop yields, count livestock, and keep a perfect inventory of every single item in a state storehouse, right down to the last sandal. But could they do more? This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the Andes, a puzzle that continues to spark intense academic debate. Historians still argue whether the quepus were purely mnemonic and numerical devices, glorified abacuses, or if they represented a true three-dimensional form of writing. Some scholars believe that the combination of colors, the direction of the ply of the string, and the complexity of the knots could have encoded not just numbers, but narratives, poems, and laws. Was it possible to read a quipu and recite a creation myth or the legal precedent for a border dispute? We know the Quipuca Mayaks went through years of rigorous training to learn to create and interpret these devices. When the Spanish arrived and demanded to know about Inca history, they were often read the stories from a quipu. Sadly, the Spanish, in their zeal to eradicate all forms of indigenous knowledge which they saw as idolatrous, burned most of the quipus and suppressed the craft of making them. The knowledge died with the last generation of keepers. As you watch the Quipuca Mayak's fingers fly, tying a new knot into a string, you realize you are looking at a lost library, a system of information as complex and profound as our own, now silenced forever. The knots of the quipu can count every potato in a storehouse and every warrior in a province, but they cannot count the gods. The intricate, orderly world of the Inca economy you've just seen is not an end in itself. It is the foundation for something far more important, the proper service of the divine. The entire state, from the Sapa Inca down to the humblest farmer, is part of a cosmic contract. You now move from the pragmatic world of administration into the shimmering, often terrifying world of Andean cosmology. You leave the plaza and approach a great temple, a wasi, its stone walls fitted with that same impossible precision, perhaps even sheathed in plates of gold that glitter in the relentless sun. The first thing you must understand is that the spiritual landscape here is crowded. It's a celestial bureaucracy of staggering complexity. At the very top, there is a remote, almost abstract creator god, Viracocha, who fashioned the world and then largely stepped back from its daily affairs. He's the divine CEO who set the company policy and then retired to an undisclosed location. The real day-to-day worship, the focus of the massive state religious cult, is directed at Inti, the sun. This is the mainstream historical fact that gives the entire empire its legitimacy. The sun is the divine ancestor of the Sapa Inca, the source of all life, warmth, and agricultural abundance. The Sapa Inca is his son, his representative on earth. To disobey the emperor is to defy the sun itself, a foolish act for anyone who enjoys, living. The great temples, staffed by thousands of priests and consecrated women, aklas, are dedicated to Inti. The most fertile lands are set aside to grow maize for his rituals. The Andean universe is seen as being divided into three distinct but interconnected realms, or pachas. You are standing now in Ke Pacha, the middle world, the world of the living. Above you is Hanan Pacha, the upper world, the realm of the celestial gods like Inti the sun, Mama Killa the moon, and Ilapa the thunder and weather god. Below your feet is Uku Pacha, the inner world or underworld. It's not a place of punishment like the Christian hell. It's the mysterious realm of the dead, the unborn, and the earth's creative power. It's less fire and brimstone and more ice and altitude. These three worlds are not sealed off from each other. They intersect at certain sacred points, places of immense spiritual power. And this brings you to the true heart of everyday Andean religion, the huacas. A huaca is anything, a place, an object, even a person, that is considered sacred, a conduit for spiritual energy. The snow-capped peak that looms over the valley is a huaca, an apu or mountain spirit that controls the weather and the herds. The spring that gives your village water is a huaca, an oddly shaped rock in a field, a gnarled ancient tree, the mummy of your great-great-grandfather kept in a cave above your village. All of these are huacas. The land is not just a resource, it is alive, pulsing with thousands of these sacred points. Life is a constant negotiation with these forces. Before taking a drink of chicha, you pour a small offering onto the ground for Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Before beginning a long journey, you leave a small stone or a wad of coca leaves at a pass in the mountains to appease the local apu. The state religion of Inti was grand and imperial, but for most people, these local huacas were the ones who really mattered, and this leads to a major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the official state religion, centered on the sun god Inti, was a unifying imperial force that successfully integrated the empire, or if it was a thin veneer laid over a much older and more powerful stratum of local, animistic beliefs in countless huacas. Did the people of a newly conquered province in Ecuador really feel a deep connection to the sun god of Cusco? Or was their true loyalty to the volcano that had governed their lives for centuries? The Inca were clever. They often incorporated local deities into their own pantheon, a bit like a divine HR department acquiring a new subsidiary. But the tension between the imperial and the local was always there. To keep this complex system in balance, to ensure the sun would rise and the rains would fall, offerings were essential. Most were simple: coca leaves, fine textiles, llamas. But for the most important occasions, a new Sapa Inca's coronation, a victory in a great war, or a time of terrible crisis like a drought or an epidemic, the gods required the most precious offering of all, a human life. This was the ritual of the Capacocha, and it's a chillingly beautiful and logical practice from within their worldview. This is a quirky, if somber, tidbit of their faith. The victims were not prisoners of war. They were perfect, unblemished children chosen from all over the empire for their beauty. To be chosen was the highest honor for a family. These children were not seen as dying. They were being sent as perfect ambassadors to live with the gods on their sacred mountain peaks. They were dressed in the finest clothes, feasted, and given chicha to drink until they fell into a deep, intoxicated sleep. Then they were taken to the highest, coldest mountain summits and gently laid in a burial chamber, where they froze to death. They became eternal guardians, conduits between their people and the divine. As you stand before the temple, you understand that this world, for all its order, is held together by a fragile web of reciprocity, a constant cycle of offerings and rituals designed to appease forces that are beautiful, life-giving, and utterly terrifying. This delicate balance is about to be shattered by the arrival of men with a single jealous god of their own. The cold, pure air of the mountain peak where the sacrificed child sleeps an eternal sleep begins to feel thin, distant. Your perspective shifts. You are swept down from the highlands, following the rivers as they rush towards the sea, descending through the cloud forests and into the hot, arid coastal plains. The world is, for a moment, in its proper, cyclical rhythm. But then, on the very edge of the world, on the vast blue expanse of the Pacific that the Inca call Mamacocha, the Mother Sea, something appears that does not belong. It is a shape that has no name in the Quechua language. Guamanpoma draws it for you. A house floating on the water with tall, leafless trees from which hang enormous sheets of cloth. These are the Spanish caravels, and with their arrival in 1532, the fifth age of man, the age of the Incas, is about to come to a violent, shuddering halt. You see them through the eyes of the coastal villagers who first witnessed their arrival. Men spill out of these floating houses, and they are unlike any humans you have ever seen. Their faces are covered in thick hair, like the fleece of a llama. Their skin is unnaturally pale where it is not burned red by the sun. But most shocking of all is what they wear. They are encased in gleaming metal shells, like giant beetles. You can imagine the clanking sound they make as they walk on the sand. The heat that must be building inside that metal armor under the equatorial sun. It's the least practical beachwear imaginable. Then there are their animals. They ride upon huge, powerful beasts that are like deer, but taller and faster, with terrifyingly loud voices. These are horses. And to the people of the Andes who had never seen a large mammal one could ride, they seem like monstrous, supernatural creatures, perhaps even a single being with the man and beast fused together. And then there is their noise. From long, black metal tubes they can produce a sound like Ilapa, the thunder god. Fire and smoke erupt from the tubes, and a small metal ball flies out with incredible speed, capable of ripping through a woven shield or a wooden wall. This is the mainstream historical fact that sealed the fate of empires across the Americas: the technological gap. The Spanish, under the command of a grizzled, ambitious conquistador named Francisco Pizarro, possessed steel swords and armor, crossbows, and primitive firearms called harquebuses. The Inca warriors, for all their bravery and discipline, had quilted cotton armor, wooden clubs, and slings. It was a terrifyingly unequal contest. Guaman Poma, in his chronicle, doesn't just focus on their technology. He zeroes in on their motivation with the precision of a surgeon. His drawings of the conquistadors are almost caricatures of greed. He draws them with manic, wide eyes, constantly grabbing at golden objects. In one famous illustration, a Spaniard holds a piece of gold up to an Inca man and asks, in Spanish, "Kai coritacho micunqui?" Do you eat this gold? The indigenous man, utterly bewildered by the question, replies, "Este oro comemos nosotros." We eat this gold, a response of pure sarcastic confusion. This exchange, which may or may not have happened literally, captures the profound, unbridgeable gap between the two cultures. For the Inca, gold and silver, the sweat of the sun and the tears of the moon, were sacred. Their value was spiritual and aesthetic, used to decorate temples and adorn the Sapa Inca. It had no monetary value. The Spanish obsession with it, their willingness to kill and die for it, seemed like a form of madness, a bizarre and insatiable hunger. Crucially, the Spanish did not arrive in a unified, stable empire. They stumbled with incredible luck into a nation that was tearing itself apart. The previous Sapa Inca had died, likely from a European disease like smallpox that had raced ahead of the conquistadors themselves, and his death triggered a devastating civil war between his two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. Just before Pizarro's arrival, Atahualpa's armies had finally defeated Huáscar's forces in a series of bloody battles. The Tawantinsuyu was exhausted, its leadership divided, its armies wounded. Pizarro was not invading an empire at the height of its power. He was a predator, sensing a fatal weakness. Did the Incas see these strange, violent men as gods? This is a common story. The idea that they mistook Pizarro for the returning creator deity, Viracocha, who was often described as being bearded. It's a romantic and convenient explanation for their defeat. But here, a deep scholarly debate rages. Historians still argue whether the Viracocha myth was a genuine belief that paralyzed the Inca response, or if it was a story invented after the conquest, a way for the survivors to rationalize how a mighty empire of millions could have fallen to a ragged band of fewer than 200 men. Guaman Poma's account is telling. He portrays the Spanish not as gods, but as barbarians. He sees their arrival not as a divine fulfillment of prophecy, but as a Pachacuti, a great and terrible cataclysm, an overturning of the proper order of the universe. As you watch Pizarro and his small, heavily armed band leave the coast and begin their audacious march inland, up into the mountains, you realize they are not just invaders. They are a walking plague, and they are heading directly for the new, victorious, and perhaps fatally overconfident Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, who is waiting for them in the mountain city of Cajamarca. You follow Pizarro's small band of men, this group of fewer than 200 adventurers, as they complete their audacious journey up into the highlands. The air grows cooler, thinner. Finally, they enter the valley of Cajamarca. The city itself is strangely, unnervingly empty. Its stone houses are silent, its plazas deserted. Pizarro's men file into the great central square, a vast walled enclosure, and the silence seems to amplify the clatter of their horses' hooves and the jangle of their armor. Then you look up. On the hillside surrounding the city, you see them. Thousands upon thousands of lights, the campfires of the victorious Inca army. The Sapa Inca Atahualpa and his legions, fresh from their victory in the Civil War, are camped just outside the city, a force of perhaps 40,000 warriors. The Spanish have walked directly into the lion's den. Pizarro, a master of the calculated risk, knows that to show fear is to die. He sends a small embassy of his best horsemen, led by the dashing Hernando de Soto, to Atahualpa's camp to invite the emperor for a meeting. You ride with them. As you approach the camp, you pass rank after rank of disciplined Inca soldiers. They are armed with hardwood spears, clubs with stone or bronze heads, and slings. They watch your small group of metal men on their monstrous beasts with a silent, unnerving curiosity. Finally, you reach the emperor's pavilion. There he is. Atahualpa, the son of the sun, the victorious lord of the Tawantinsuyu. He is seated on a low golden stool, surrounded by his nobles and his women. He is in his mid-30s, handsome and imposing. On his head he wears the scarlet fringe of the Mascaypacha. What happens next is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Atahualpa, displaying a supreme, almost divine arrogance, completely ignores the Spaniards. He does not even look at them. De Soto delivers his invitation through a young, inexperienced native interpreter named Felipilo, whose grasp of both Spanish and Quechua is shaky at best. It's like trying to negotiate a nuclear treaty using a phrasebook you bought at the airport. Atahualpa remains silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Only after a tense, prolonged silence does one of his nobles speak for him, acknowledging the message. To break the tension and display Spanish power, De Soto does something extraordinary. He spurs his horse and performs a series of brilliant dressage maneuvers, a display of power and control. Then, he gallops his warhorse directly at the seated Inca, reining it in at the very last second, so close that the flecks of foam from the horse's breath spatter the emperor's royal person. Atahualpa does not move a muscle. He doesn't even blink. He is immovable, a living god. Later, you learn that several of the nobles and guards who flinched or showed fear were executed for their cowardice. Atahualpa agrees to visit Pizarro in the Cajamarca Square the next day. He will come to see what these strange men have to offer. Pizarro and his captains return to the city, knowing they are hopelessly outnumbered. A conventional battle would be suicide, so Pizarro devises one of the most audacious and treacherous plans in military history, an ambush. That night, the city of Cajamarca is transformed into a giant trap. Pizarro hides his small cavalry force in the alleyways leading into the square. He places his foot soldiers and a few small cannons inside the long, empty buildings that line the plaza. He gives his men a simple order. When they hear the signal, they are to burst out and kill, making as much noise as possible to create terror and confusion. Their one single objective: capture the Sapa Inca alive. The entire Spanish enterprise hinges on this one desperate gamble. The next day, November 16, 1532, you wait in the unnerving silence of the square. The hours drag on. Finally, in the late afternoon, the procession arrives. This is the pivotal moment in the conquest of Peru, a mainstream historical fact that changed the world. Atahualpa is not coming for a battle. He is arriving for a state ceremony. He is carried aloft on a magnificent litter of gold and silver, lined with parrot feathers. He is surrounded by thousands of his retainers, dancers, singers, and nobles, all in their finest ceremonial attire. They are almost entirely unarmed. They have come to impress, not to fight. The procession fills the square. Then, a lone figure walks out to meet them, the Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde. He holds a cross in one hand and a book, a breviary or a Bible, in the other. This is where the encounter tips into the realm of the truly bizarre. Through the bumbling interpreter Felipillo, Valverde begins to read the Requerimiento. This was a legalistic document the Spanish were required to read to native peoples before commencing hostilities. It was a dense theological text explaining the creation of the world, the authority of the Pope, and the King of Spain's right to these lands, demanding that Atahualpa submit to both. Atahualpa, Listening to this garbled, incomprehensible speech, is understandably confused and then angered. He asks to see the book, this object that is the source of the Spaniards' authority. He has never seen a book before. He thumbs through the pages, sees that it does not speak, and in a gesture of contempt, throws it to the ground. That is the signal. Valverde cries out to Pizarro. Pizarro gives the order. A cannon fires. The Spanish war cry, Santiago, erupts from the buildings. The horsemen charge into the dense, panicked crowd. The foot soldiers emerge, their steel swords a terrifying, flashing blur. The Inca nobles, unarmed, form a human wall around Atahualpa's litter, trying to protect him with their bare hands. They are cut down. The litter bearers are killed, but others immediately take their place, holding the litter up until their own arms are severed. The chaos is absolute. In the midst of the slaughter, Pizarro himself fights his way to the litter and personally seizes the Sapa Inca. In a matter of minutes, the divine ruler of the largest empire in the Americas is a prisoner. The square is a scene of unimaginable carnage. The world has been turned on its head. Historians still argue whether Atahualpa's decision to enter the square unarmed was a sign of supreme arrogance, a fatal underestimation of his foe, or a calculated move to intimidate the Spanish with his sheer numbers and divine presence. Whatever the reason, it was a cataclysmic miscalculation. The dust settles in the blood-soaked square of Cajamarca. The Sapa Inca Atahualpa, the son of the sun, is a prisoner. The divine body that could not be touched by commoners is now bound in iron chains. For the people of the Tawantinsuyu, this is an event beyond comprehension. It is as if the sun itself has been snatched from the sky and locked in a box. The entire cosmic order has been broken, and an unnerving silence falls over the empire as it holds its breath, waiting to see what the hairy, metal-clad men will do next. The answer, as it always is with them, involves gold. Atahualpa is a shrewd and observant man. He quickly grasps the strange, pathological hunger that drives these invaders. He sees their eyes light up at the sight of his golden utensils, his silver jewelry. He formulates a plan, not just to save his life, but to buy his freedom and rid his land of these disruptive outsiders. He makes Pizarro an offer that is the stuff of legend, a wager so grand it seems impossible. Standing in the room where he is being held captive, a chamber roughly 22 feet long by 17 feet wide, he reaches up as high as he can and makes a mark on the wall. He promises to fill this entire room, up to that mark, once with gold, and then he promises to fill it twice over with silver. This is the famous ransom of Atahualpa, a mainstream historical fact that represents the single largest ransom ever paid for an individual in human history. You have to understand the profound cultural disconnect happening in this moment. To Atahualpa, he is not paying a bribe. He is making a sacred offering of unimaginable scale, demonstrating his immense power and wealth. A gift so large it should satisfy and overwhelm the strangers, compelling them to release him and leave. To Pizarro and his men, it's the greatest lottery win in history. They draw up a formal contract, as if this were a simple business deal. Atahualpa is given a deadline of 2 months. The ultimate GoFundMe campaign has just been launched, with an entire empire as its donor base. Word goes out. The Shaskis run the length of the Kapaknyan, carrying the emperor's command. A great mournful stripping of the empire begins. Convoys of llamas, laden with treasure, begin the long journey to Cajamarca. They bring exquisite works of art, priceless artifacts that have been held sacred for generations, life-sized golden statues of llamas, delicate silver cornstalks with leaves of beaten silver, and tassels of golden thread, massive ceremonial vessels, and the heavy gold plates that once sheathed the walls of the Coricancha, the great temple of the sun in Cusco. For the Inca, this is a deeply sacrilegious act, surrendering the very sweat of the sun and tears of the moon. For the Spanish, it's just raw tonnage. As the treasure arrives, they begin to melt it all down. Imagine taking the entire collection of the Louvre, every priceless sculpture and painting, and tossing it into a furnace to be melted into crude, featureless bars, simply because the raw materials are easier to weigh and divide. That is what happens in Cajamarca. An entire civilization's artistic heritage is liquidated. And after all of it, after the room is filled and the treasure is divided amongst the conquistadors, making them all fantastically wealthy, they do not release him. They can't. They know a freed Atahualpa would raise an army and annihilate them. So they do what treacherous men do. They invent a justification. They stage a mockery of a trial. Atahualpa is charged with a laundry list of absurd crimes in the eyes of the Spanish. Idolatry, polygamy, and most cynically, of usurping the throne from his brother Huáscar, the very civil war that had made the Spanish conquest possible. He is found guilty and sentenced to be burned at the stake. At the last moment, Friar Valverde offers him a deal: convert to Christianity, and he will be granted a more merciful death by strangulation with a garrote. This matters immensely to Atahualpa, not out of fear of the fire, but because in the Andean worldview, the body had to be preserved for the afterlife. To be burned was to be annihilated for eternity. He agrees, is baptized with the name Francisco, and is then quietly garroted in the plaza. The sun has been extinguished. With the emperor dead, the Spanish march on the capital Cusco. They are not just soldiers anymore. They are the new management. And they quickly realize that ruling millions of people in a vast mountainous territory is a lot harder than ambushing an unarmed procession. Their first instinct is not to destroy the Inca system, but to hijack it. They install a new pliable puppet Inca, a young prince named Manco Inca, to rule in their name and keep the population calm. But the old systems begin to fray and snap under the weight of their greed. They take over the Inca palaces, loot the temples, and demand services from the local populations without any of the old reciprocal obligations of the Mid-A. Here is a strange and telling tidbit about this transition. One of the first things the Spanish did upon entering Cusco was to hunt down the royal mummies of the previous Sapa Incas. These were not just dead bodies, they were sacred ancestors who were treated as if they were still alive with their own estates, servants, and were regularly brought out for festivals. The Spanish, seeing this as demonic necromancy, confiscated the mummies, effectively kidnapping the dead kings. This act struck at the very heart of the Incas' connection to their past and their cosmos. This brings us to a key debate. Historians still argue whether the Spanish initially intended a more orderly transfer of power, simply placing the King of Spain at the apex of the existing Inca pyramid while leaving the local administration intact, or if their goal was always the complete dismantling of the indigenous power structure. The evidence suggests the former was the plan, but the insatiable greed of the individual conquistadors and the crown's desire for fast revenue made it impossible. The system collapsed into a chaotic free-for-all of looting and exploitation. The age of the soldier is ending. Now comes the age of the bureaucrat, the lawyer, and the tax collector, and they will dismantle the Tawantinsuyu not just with swords, but with stamps, seals, and stacks of paper. The puppet Inca sits on a throne in Cusco, but the strings of power are now held by a new class of master, the Spanish colonist. The initial, chaotic phase of looting is over. Now the extraction of wealth needs to be organized, bureaucratized, and made sustainable, and the Spanish have the perfect legal instrument to do it. It's a system that sounds almost noble on paper, a contract of benevolent paternalism. It's called the encomienda, and Guaman Poma is about to show you, with his unforgiving ink lines, how it became a license for enslavement. This is the mainstream historical fact that defines the first century of Spanish rule in the Americas. The encomienda was not a grant of land, it was a grant of people. The Spanish crown would entrust encomendar, a community of indigenous people, to a deserving Spaniard, usually a conquistador or a well-connected official, known as an encomendero. In exchange for the right to collect tribute, in the form of goods or, more importantly, labor, from this community, the encomendero had two sacred duties: to provide for their military protection and, crucially, to ensure they were instructed in the Catholic faith. It was framed as a civilizing mission, a way to bring salvation to the natives while incorporating them into the colonial economy. Guaman Poma's drawings shred this noble facade. He shows you the reality. In one illustration, you see an encomendero. He is not a noble protector or a pious teacher. He is a corpulent man slumped lazily in a hammock, being fanned by one native servant while another brings him a drink. His face is a mask of indolent cruelty. This is a recurring theme in Poma's work. The Spanish colonists do not work. They are parasites growing fat on the labor of others. He contrasts this with his drawings of Inca officials, who are always depicted as active, inspecting storehouses, overseeing road construction, dispensing justice. He is drawing a moral universe where laziness, one of the three great Inca sins, has become the defining characteristic of the new ruling class. The most insidious part of this new system is how it hijacked and perverted the old Inca institutions. The Spanish saw the mitad, the rotational labor tax, and their eyes must have lit up. Here was a ready-made system for mobilizing a massive workforce. But they took the Andean concept of reciprocal labor and stripped it for parts. They kept the obligation but discarded the responsibility. Under the Inca, your mitad term was for a set period, after which you returned home. The state fed you, clothed you, and gave you chicha. Your family was cared for by your ailu. Under the Spanish encomendero, the mitad became a one-way street. You were sent away for much longer periods, sometimes for a year or more, often to places with radically different climates. You were not provided with food, tools, or lodging. You had to bring your own, and if they ran out, you starved. No one cared if your family's fields back home lay fallow. You see the ultimate expression of this corrupted mid-A as you are taken to a place that would become a synonym for death and suffering, the Great Silver Mountain of Potosi. It was a literal mountain of silver ore, the richest source the world had ever seen. To extract this silver, the Spanish colonial government required a MITA of 13,500 men per year from communities hundreds of miles away. Guaman Poma draws a chilling scene from inside this mouth of hell. A native miner, a flickering candle strapped to his forehead, climbs a terrifyingly flimsy ladder made of leather straps and wooden rungs, a heavy bag of ore strapped to his back. The air is thick with toxic dust and the fumes of mercury, which was used to amalgamate the silver. Rockfalls are constant. Men who entered the mines often never came out. Their lungs were destroyed, they died of exhaustion, or they succumbed to mercury poisoning. It wasn't a rotational labor service, it was a death sentence. And if the brutal labor wasn't enough to crush you, the colonists invented ever more creative ways to keep you in their debt. This brings us to a truly bizarre and cruel quirk of the colonial economy, the repartimiento de mercancías. A local Spanish magistrate, the corregidor, would arrive in your village and force the entire community to buy a shipment of goods from him at absurdly inflated prices. The catch? The goods were almost always completely useless. He would force sell silk stockings and fancy lace to farmers who worked barefoot in the mud, or eyeglasses to people with perfect vision. The most infamous example was being forced to buy razors, a product for which men with little to no facial hair had absolutely no use. You couldn't refuse the sale. You were now in debt to the corregidor, a debt that could only be paid off with, you guessed it, more labor. It's the 16th century version of a payday loan scam, but with more pickaxes and mercury poisoning. This leads to a fundamental question for historians. They still argue whether the horrors of the encomienda and the Potosi mitad were the intended outcome of a ruthless imperial policy designed to extract maximum wealth at any human cost, or if they were the result of a catastrophic failure of oversight, where the Crown's more humane laws were simply ignored by greedy colonists thousands of miles from Madrid. The Spanish crown did, in fact, pass laws meant to curb the worst abuses, but on the remote Andean frontier, the saying went, "Obedezco pero no cumplo," I obey, but I do not comply. For Guaman Poma, this debate is irrelevant. He sees the results on the ground. A world where justice has been replaced by greed, and the sacred reciprocity of labor has been twisted into an engine of death. The physical suffering is immense, but it is accompanied by a spiritual assault of equal magnitude, as the men with the cross follow the men with the sword. The suffering you witnessed in the mines and fields of the encomienda was the physical price of colonization. But remember the contract? The encomendero wasn't just entitled to your labor, he was obligated to bring you salvation. You now turn your gaze from the body to the soul, to the other half of this grand coercive bargain. The conversion to Christianity. You stand at the edge of your village plaza. A Franciscan friar has arrived, his rough brown robes a stark contrast to the vibrant colors of your community's hand-woven textiles. He carries no sword, but in his hands, he holds a wooden cross and a book, weapons that will prove just as disruptive as any Toledo steel. The process you are about to undergo is one of bewildering speed and profound confusion. The entire ALU is herded towards a hastily constructed church, a simple adobe building that still smells of damp earth and fresh plaster. Inside, it is dark and cold. The priest begins to speak, his words in Spanish or Latin, a harsh, guttural sound that means nothing to you. The young and often terrified native interpreter struggles to translate. He tries to explain the concept of a single, all-powerful God, a creator who exists outside of the physical world. This is a tough sell. For you, the divine is immanent. It's in the mountain that watches over you, the river that gives you water, the mummified ancestor you consult for advice. The idea of a God who isn't also a place or an object is a radical, almost nonsensical abstraction. Then comes the Trinity. The interpreter tries to explain that this one God is also somehow three separate persons: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You can see the collective shrug of your community. It's like explaining quantum physics to someone who has only ever used a quipu. You already have a pantheon of gods. Adding three more, especially ones who are also one, is just confusing. But you don't have a choice. You are lined up, and the priest sprinkles water on your head, muttering words you don't understand. You are given a new name, a nombre de cristiano, Juan, Maria, Pedro, that feels like a borrowed cloak. Congratulations, you are now a Christian. The box has been ticked. The encomendero has on paper fulfilled his duty. But the church knew this veneer of mass baptism was tissue thin. They knew that as soon as the priest left, you would go back to leaving offerings for the apu and consulting your ancestors. So, a new, more aggressive phase began: the extirpation of idolatry. This is the mainstream historical fact that represents the spiritual conquest of the Andes. This was not about teaching. It was a systematic campaign to find and destroy every last trace of your ancestral religion. Priests became inquisitors. They would travel from village to village armed with questionnaires, interrogating the local elders. Where are the huacas hidden? Who are the shamans who still speak with the old gods? Show us the cave where you keep the mummies of your grandfathers. They were the ultimate spiritual Marie Kondos, and if your local mountain spirit didn't spark joy for the Catholic Church, it was thanked for its service and then smashed with a hammer. Guamanpoma draws these scenes with grim clarity. A priest directing workers to shatter a sacred stone, to burn a collection of revered ancestral mummies in a great bonfire. This relentless assault on their spiritual world provoked a desperate, mystical resistance. From the 1560s onward, a strange movement began to sweep through the highlands. It was called Taki Onkoi, which translates to dancing sickness. This is a truly fascinating and quirky episode in Andean history. People, seemingly at random, would be seized by fits. They would begin to tremble and dance uncontrollably for days on end, often falling into a trance. When they spoke, it was not with their own voices. They claimed to be possessed by the huacas, the old gods who had been smashed and desecrated by the Spanish. The gods, they preached, were angry. They were returning to reclaim their land, to send a great flood or plague that would kill all the Spaniards and wipe away their foreign god. It was less a religious revival, and more the world's first underground rave scene, a form of spiritual protest expressed through the body. The Taki Onkoi called for a total rejection of all things Spanish: their names, their clothes, their food, and especially their god. The Spanish authorities, seeing this as a demonic rebellion, crushed the movement with arrests and floggings. The Taki Onkoi was driven underground, but it never truly went away. This leads to one of the most enduring debates about this period. Historians still argue whether the conversion of the Andes was a success, resulting in the replacement of one faith with another, or if it simply created a new hybrid religion, a complex system of syncretism. Did the old gods really die, or did they just learn to hide in plain sight? You see it happening all around you. Your community begins to associate the powerful mountain Apu with a particular Catholic saint who is often depicted on a horse. You begin to pray to the Virgin Mary, but you see in her the compassionate, nurturing face of Pachamama, the Earth Mother. You celebrate the feast day of Corpus Christi, but the timing happens to coincide with the old Inca festival of the sun, and the procession feels strangely familiar. The outward forms are Catholic, but the inner spiritual grammar remains deeply Andean. You are learning to speak a new religious language, but with a thick, ancient accent. Guaman Poma, a devout Catholic himself, sees this chaos and hypocrisy. He doesn't blame the Christian faith. He blames the Christians. He believes these priests, with their violence and their greed, are doing a terrible job. They are not bringing true salvation. They are bringing confusion and suffering. He picks up his pen to show the king not just the failure of the priests as teachers, but their profound corruption as men. His pen doesn't just sketch generalities. It becomes an instrument of accusation, naming names and drawing specific sins with the clarity of a courtroom sketch artist. You are no longer just observing the system. You are looking over Guaman Poma's shoulder as he fearlessly documents the personal, intimate corruption of the men who claim to hold the moral high ground. He wants King Philip to see that the problem isn't just a flawed policy, it's a profound crisis of character. He begins with the priests, the very men entrusted with the salvation of his people. In one of his most powerful drawings, you see a parish priest, a doctrinero, seated at a lavishly set table. He is fat, his jowls spilling over the collar of his cassock. He holds a goblet of wine in one hand and gestures greedily towards a platter of food with the other. Surrounding him are indigenous women, their expressions a mixture of resignation and fear. One is cooking for him, another is serving him, and in the background another is shown spinning thread. The caption is damning. It speaks of the priest's gluttony, his drunkenness, and his insatiable appetites. This is the man who has taken a vow of poverty and chastity. In Poma's depiction, he has transformed his parish into a personal fiefdom, a combination of a private restaurant and a textile factory, all run on unpaid female labor. It's less a house of God and more a house of unlimited, divinely sanctioned appetizers. This is the quirky and deeply disturbing tidbit that Poma returns to again and again: the sexual exploitation of native women by the clergy. Priests would often demand that young, unmarried women live in or near the parish house, ostensibly to receive religious instruction or to serve the church as weavers of altar cloths. In reality, they became the priest's concubines, trapped in a system of coercion that was impossible to refuse. To defy a priest was to defy God, and the social and physical consequences were severe. Poma, a man who dedicates an entire section of his book to the proper moral conduct of women, is incandescent with rage at this hypocrisy. He draws scenes of priests beating women who resist their advances, of children born from these illicit unions who are then denied their father's name or support. He is exposing a systematic pattern of abuse, a rot that starts at the very heart of the spiritual conquest. And the priests are not acting alone. They often work in a cozy, corrupt partnership with the ranking Spanish secular official in the district, the Corregidor de Indios. The Corregidor was, in theory, the king's local representative, a combination of magistrate, police chief, and tax collector. His job was to protect the native population from abuse and administer royal justice. In practice, as Poma illustrates with brutal repetition, they were often the worst abusers of all. You see them in his drawings, always with a whip or a staff in hand, demanding tribute, seizing land, and beating anyone who dares to complain. They were the architects of the repartimiento de mercancías you saw earlier, the forced sale of useless goods. The priest would use his pulpit to declare that buying the corregidor's overpriced lace was a Christian duty, and the corregidor would use his authority to ensure the priest's wine cellar was always full. It was a perfectly symbiotic relationship of graft and sin. Now the Spanish crown was not entirely blind to this. This is a key mainstream historical fact. The colonial administration had an official mechanism to investigate and punish such corruption. It was called the visita, a formal inspection tour conducted by a high-ranking judge sent from a major city. When the visitador arrived, everyone in the district had the right to air their grievances. But Poma shows you how this system was a farce. In one drawing, you see a corregidor bowing and scraping before the visiting judge, slipping him a purse of gold coins under the table. The judge, in turn, finds no evidence of wrongdoing. The system policed itself, and the price of a clean report was just another tax on the local community. The game was rigged from the start. This reality of pervasive, unpunishable corruption fuels a major debate. Historians still argue whether the Spanish colonial system was inherently designed for extraction and exploitation, making such abuses inevitable, or if the Crown's genuinely paternalistic and protective laws were simply too difficult to enforce across a vast ocean and impenetrable mountains. Was the problem the colonial system itself, or the moral failure of the individual colonists who ran it? For Guaman Poma, this is no abstract question. He sees it as a complete and total breakdown of buen gobierno, or good government. He believed that the Spanish officials, from the viceroy down to the local priest, had broken their sacred contract with both God and the king. He is not just a passive observer of this corruption. In some of his most striking and personal illustrations, he draws himself into the scene. You see him, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, a proud Andean nobleman, pointing an accusing finger, confronting a corrupt priest, or even physically kicking a cruel encomendero out of a village. He is casting himself as the hero of his own story, the one man willing to stand up and speak the truth. He is not just writing a letter. He is building a legal case, and the next exhibit for the king will be the women of the Andes, caught in the crossfire of these two broken worlds. You've seen the sins of the fathers, the priests and officials whose hypocrisy poisons the new colonial world. Now Guaman Poma directs your attention to the devastating consequences of that moral decay, focusing on those who bore its heaviest burden, the women of the Andes. To understand the depth of this tragedy, he first shows you the world that was lost. He draws for you the life of a woman under the Inca. His illustrations depict a society of strict roles and responsibilities, a world where a woman's life was mapped out in a series of 10 stages, from a baby in a cradle to a respected elder. You see young girls helping their mothers, learning to weave and cook. You see newly married women, the cornerstones of their households. You see older widows who are cared for by the community. In Poma's idealized vision, every woman has a place, a purpose, and, most importantly, protection. This was based on a core principle of Andean society: gender complementarity. This is the mainstream historical fact that governed social relations before the Spanish. Men and women had different roles, but these roles were seen as interconnected and equally essential for the survival of the community. The man's domain was the footplow, the battlefield, and public office. The woman's domain was the hearth, the fields alongside the men, and crucially the loom. Weaving was not just a craft, it was a sacred art and a vital economic activity. The intricate textiles women produced were a form of wealth, a religious offering, and a marker of social status. The Sapa Inca's power came from the sun. The Koya, his sister wife, drew her power from the moon. One could not exist without the other. They were two halves of a whole. The Spanish conquest shattered this delicate balance. The very concept of gender complementarity was incomprehensible to the conquistadors, who came from a deeply patriarchal society where women were seen as the property of their fathers or husbands. They saw Andean women not as partners in a cosmic duality, but as a resource to be exploited. Just like the land and its silver, the destruction began with the family unit. The brutal one-way Mita system ripped men away from their Elis for months or years at a time. The reciprocal bonds of the community, which had ensured a woman's protection and sustenance while her husband was away, were broken. Suddenly, women were left alone to feed their children, tend the fields, and meet the relentless tribute demands of the encomendero. They became the sole providers in a system designed to crush them. This new vulnerability made them easy prey. Guaman Poma's drawings become almost unbearable to look at. He shows Spanish soldiers, colonists, and officials dragging women from their homes. He illustrates the constant threat of sexual violence that became a part of daily life. For a Spanish man to take a native woman, by force or by coercion, was not seen as a grave sin. It was considered a perquisite of conquest. Poma is meticulous in showing how this disrupted the entire social fabric. Marriages were broken, children were born without fathers, and the traditional lines of kinship and inheritance that held the Elu together dissolved into chaos. In this chaotic new world, Some women found precarious paths to survival, and this is a quirky and complex part of the story. A number of indigenous women, particularly from noble families, became the mistresses or common law wives of powerful Spaniards. These women served as crucial cultural intermediaries. They learned Spanish, adopted Spanish dress, and managed the households of their colonial masters. For some, this was a path to a degree of security and even wealth, and their mixed-race children, the mestizos, would come to form a new and powerful class in colonial society. But their position was always insecure. They were rarely married in the church, and they and their children could be cast aside if the Spaniard decided to take a legitimate Spanish wife. Poma, with his rigid moral code, has little sympathy for these women. He often draws them as collaborators, women who have abandoned their people and their traditions for the tainted comforts of the Spanish world. This complex reality has led to a nuanced scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the conquest should be viewed as a universally disastrous event for Andean women, or if, amid the undeniable horror, it unintentionally opened up new, albeit risky, avenues for female agency. Some women proved remarkably adept at navigating the new colonial legal system. There are court records of indigenous women suing Spanish men for property, for child support, or for relief from tribute. Some became successful entrepreneurs, dominating the local food markets in the new colonial cities. These women were not passive victims. They were survivors fighting to carve out a space for themselves in a world designed to erase them. For Poma, however, these exceptions do not change the fundamental truth. He sees a world where the sacred bond between men and women has been broken, where the complementary duality of sun and moon has been replaced by a brutal hierarchy of predator and prey. The system that was meant to protect these women, the law, has failed them completely. He now turns his attention to that system, to compare the swift, clear justice of the Inca with the tangled, corrupt mess of the Spanish courts. The suffering of these women, and indeed of your entire community, is not met with silence. You cry out for justice, but where do you go? Under the Inca, the path was clear. You would go to your local curaca, who would hear your case in the open plaza. If the matter was serious, it would go up a clear chain of command, perhaps even to an imperial governor. The process, as you remember it, was oral, public, and incredibly swift. Judgment was passed and the matter was closed. The law, like a well-aimed stone from a sling, flew straight to its mark. Now that path is gone, overgrown with weeds and forgotten. In its place is a new road to a new kind of house, the Spanish courthouse, the juzgado, and you find that this road is a labyrinth paved with paper and toll gates. You enter the office of a colonial scribe, an escribano. The air is thick with the smell of ink, dusty paper, and the faint, waxy scent of seals. The room is a testament to a new kind of power, the power of the written word. Shelves are crammed with bound volumes of legal records, and stacks of documents are piled high on every surface. This is the mainstream historical fact of the Spanish colonial project. It was, from start to finish, an immense bureaucratic and legalistic enterprise. The Spanish were obsessed with documenting everything. Every petition, every land sale, every complaint had to be written down by a licensed notary on officially stamped paper, which, of course, you had to pay for. It's the 16th century equivalent of the DMV, but with higher stakes and more ruffles. You state your case to the scribe through an interpreter. Let's say a Spaniard has seized your ancestral land. The scribe listens, his expression one of profound boredom, and his quill pen begins to scratch across the page, translating your lived injustice into the dry, formulaic language of Spanish legal code. This document, your petition, is now the only thing that matters. Your spoken testimony is irrelevant without it. But this piece of paper is just the first step on a journey that could last a lifetime. To file it, there's a fee. To have it delivered to the magistrate, there's another fee. The magistrate is busy. Perhaps a small gift could persuade his clerk to place your document on top of the pile. You are no longer seeking justice. You are purchasing a lottery ticket in a game rigged against you. This is the world Poma exposes. Justice is for sale, and the price is far beyond the means of a common farmer. His drawings depict this reality with biting satire. You see a Spanish judge with one hand outstretched to receive a bribe from a wealthy Spaniard, while the other hand gestures dismissively at a poor, kneeling Indian. The scales of justice are no longer balanced. They are weighted down with gold. The entire system runs on a currency of corruption that flows from the bottom to the top. The local corregidor collects his illegal fees, and a portion of that flows up to the judges in the High Court, the Audiencia, in Lima or La Plata, to ensure they look the other way during his official review. This brings us to a wonderfully bizarre and tragic quirk of this new system. The Andes, almost overnight, became one of the most litigious societies on the planet. Everyone was suing everyone. Indigenous communities spent what little they had hiring Spanish lawyers to sue abusive encomenderos. Competing curacas sued each other over land rights, using Spanish courts to continue old pre-conquest rivalries. And a new class of professional troublemakers emerged, people who understood the labyrinthine system and used it to file endless, frivolous lawsuits to harass their enemies or extort settlements. The old Inca sin of "don't lie" had been replaced by a system that actively rewarded the most creative and persistent liar. But could an indigenous person ever actually win in this system? This is a topic of intense scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Spanish legal system, for all its flaws, represented a genuine attempt to provide a universal framework of justice, accessible to all subjects of the king, including indigenous people, or if it was fundamentally an instrument of colonial control, designed to legitimize Spanish authority and dispossess the natives through a veneer of due process. The surprising truth is that indigenous plaintiffs did sometimes win. The Spanish crown, in its own way, was concerned with justice and had passed laws protecting native rights. If you had a good case, a good lawyer, and enough money and patience to see it through, you could prevail. But those were very big ifs. For Guaman Poma, this was not a theoretical debate. He was a veteran of this paper war. He spent decades and his entire family fortune embroiled in a massive lawsuit to reclaim his ancestral lands in the Huánuco region. He traveled to Lima, hired lawyers, filed petitions, and navigated the suffocating bureaucracy of the Audiencia. He experienced the corruption, the delays, and the crushing frustration firsthand. He saw how the legal word, which was supposed to be a tool for truth, could be twisted into a weapon of the powerful. His own case ultimately failed. It was this personal, bitter defeat that radicalized him. He realized that trying to fight the system from within, using its own corrupt language, was a fool's errand. If he couldn't get justice from the king's courts, he would have to go over their heads and appeal directly to the king himself. But how? He knew a simple letter, another piece of paper to be lost in the archives, wouldn't work. He needed a new language, one that could cut through the noise and speak directly to the monarch's conscience. He needed a language of pictures. And so, you arrive at the heart of his genius, the solution to the problem of the deaf ears and blind eyes of colonial justice. If the written word has become a tool of the corrupt, a tangled forest of fees and formulas, he will forge a new language. You now look at his 398 drawings not as simple illustrations but as the primary text of his argument. You are learning to read Guaman Poma's code. He's about to give you a masterclass in how to weaponize a picture. At first glance, his style might seem crude or childlike to your modern eye, which is accustomed to photorealism and sophisticated computer graphics. The perspective is a bit wobbly, the figures are often flat and stiff, and the anatomy can be unconventional, but you quickly realize that to dismiss this as primitive art is to miss the point entirely. This is the mainstream historical fact about his work. Guaman Poma was a master of a hybrid, or mestizo, artistic style. He borrows certain conventions from the European woodcuts and engravings he has seen in religious books. He uses hatching to show shadow, for instance, and he draws figures in profile. But he deploys these foreign techniques within a distinctly Andean framework of meaning. He is not trying to create a realistic, three-dimensional window onto the world in the style of the Italian Renaissance. He is creating a diagram of power, a visual affidavit. Look at how he organizes the space on the page. In the Andean worldview, space is not neutral, it is charged with meaning. The top of any space is Hanan, upper, superior, and the bottom is Urin, lower, inferior. In his drawings, the most important or powerful figure is almost always placed higher up on the page. The Sapa Inca sits on a high platform. God is at the very top of his maps of the cosmos. A Spanish official sits on a chair, while the native person he is abusing is always on the ground, kneeling or falling. This vertical hierarchy is simple, direct, and instantly understandable. But then you notice something more subtle, a quirky and brilliant code hidden in plain sight. In Andean thought, the right side is superior to the left. The right represents masculinity, power, order, and dominance. The left represents femininity, the subordinate, the conquered. Now look at his drawings of encounters between Spaniards and Andeans. In almost every single one where a Spaniard is asserting his power, the Spaniard is on the right side of the page, and the native person is on the left. The composition of the drawing itself reinforces the colonial power dynamic. It's the world's most politically charged seating chart. But then Poma does something subversive. When he draws a scene from the Inca past showing a good government, he places the Inca official on the superior right side. And in his final section, when he proposes a new world order, he draws himself and the King of Spain on the same level, equals. With a simple placement of a figure, he is making a profound political statement about legitimacy and justice. This very point leads to a passionate scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Guaman Poma's unrealistic style was a result of his being a self-taught artist with limited technical skill, or if it was a deliberate and sophisticated political choice. Earlier scholars tended to view him as a naive artist, doing his best to copy European models but not quite succeeding. But the modern consensus has shifted dramatically. Most experts now believe that Poma knew exactly what he was doing. He intentionally rejected European conventions like single-point perspective because they did not serve his purpose. An Andean textile, for instance, is read from the bottom up, not into a distant vanishing point. Poma's flat, layered composition prioritizes clarity and symbolic meaning over the illusion of depth. It's a bit like the modern art debate where someone looks at a Picasso and says, "My 5-year-old could have painted that." The point isn't that Picasso couldn't draw a realistic face. It's that he chose not to, in order to express something more powerful. Poma is doing the same. You start noticing other symbols. Bare feet are a constant signifier of humility and poverty. The Inca nobility wore elegant sandals. The Spanish are always in boots or shoes. In his drawings, the abused native is always barefoot. Their connection to the sacred earth now a mark of their subjugation. The quality of clothing is another code. A corrupt official is drawn with fine Spanish ruffs and silks, while his victims are in rags. And then there is the power of the gesture. His figures are not static. They are actors in a drama. A finger points in accusation. A hand is raised to strike. A head is bowed in despair. Speech itself is made visible, with lines flowing from the mouths of speakers, a visual trick borrowed from some medieval European art, but used here to give voice to his subjects. Through this visual lexicon, he is ensuring his message cannot be missed. Even if the king's advisor only flips through the book, glancing at the pictures, he will receive the full force of the argument. This is not a petition with illustrations. This is the first ever graphic novel sent to a European monarch, and it is a devastating indictment. This powerful visual language you have just learned to decode is not art for art's sake. It is evidence. The entire 200-page manuscript, with its hundreds of drawings and dense looping script, is a single, monumental legal brief. It is Exhibit A through ZZZ in the case of the Andean peoples versus the Spanish colonial administration. Guaman Poma is not just a historian or a witness. He is the lead prosecutor, and he is making his closing argument directly to the highest judge in the land, King Philip III of Spain. Every word he writes, every line he draws, is calibrated for an audience of one. To understand the genius of his strategy, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the king. You are Philip III, seated in your palace in Madrid. You are a profoundly devout Catholic. You believe with every fiber of your being that you are God's chosen representative on earth, that your authority flows directly from the divine. You see yourself not as a tyrant but as a father to all your subjects, even the distant ones in the so-called New World. Your sacred duty is to dispense justice and ensure the salvation of their souls. This is the mainstream historical fact that Poma leverages with breathtaking skill. He doesn't challenge the king as authority. He appeals to it. He doesn't reject Christianity. He embraces it as the standard by which the colonists should be judged and found wanting. The Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno is structured with the precision of a legal argument. The first part, the New Chronicle, is where he establishes his client's bona fides. He lays out the entire history of the Andes, the 4 ages of man, the orderly perfection of the Tawantinsuyu. He synchronizes this history with the Bible, arguing that his people were part of God's creation and were living in a state of natural law, already predisposed to Christianity. He is telling the king, Your Majesty, these were not savage heathens. They were a noble, well-governed people, the perfect raw material for a great Christian kingdom. They were an asset, and your employees have squandered it. Then comes the second part, which details the conquest and the colonial regime. This is the heart of the indictment. Page after page, drawing after drawing, he lays out the crimes. The illegal ambush and murder of Atahualpa, the rampant greed of the encomenderos, the sexual violence of the priests, the corruption of the judges. He constantly frames these abuses not as sins against the Andean people, but as sins against God and as acts of treason against the king. The colonists are not just being cruel, they are breaking the king's own laws. They are not just stealing gold, they are robbing the royal treasury of its rightful fifth. He is creating a document so long and detailed that no one in their right mind would ever want to read it, which is, now that I think about it, the basic strategy behind most modern legal documents. But unlike a simple complaint, he doesn't stop there. This is what elevates his work from a mere chronicle of suffering to a political masterpiece. The final and longest section is titled, Good Government. He is not just presenting a problem, he is offering a comprehensive, minutely detailed solution. He knows it's not enough to tell the king that his colonial administration is a disaster. He has to show him exactly how to fix it. This is his blueprint for a new world. And here, in this final section, you see Guaman Poma's ambition in its most audacious and quirky form. He doesn't just propose a series of abstract reforms. He proposes himself as the man to implement them. He draws himself as the king's ideal advisor, the wise old Andean lord who can bridge the two worlds. In one of the final drawings, he creates a new coat of arms for the Spanish Indies, one that blends the castles and lions of Spain with the falcon and puma of his own noble lineage. It's the ultimate act of self-promotion. It's the boldest job application in history, essentially telling the king, your current colonial managers are terrible. Fire them and hire me. My resume is 200 pages long. Of course, this raises a crucial question. Historians still argue whether Guaman Poma realistically expected King Philip III to ever personally read his work, or if he was writing for a different audience altogether. Was his true target the members of the Council of the Indies, the powerful administrative body that governed the colonies, hoping that some sympathetic official would champion his cause? Or was he perhaps writing for a higher judge, God himself, creating a perfect, incorruptible record of the truth to be judged on the last day? Or maybe, in his heart, he knew the letter might never arrive, and he was writing for posterity, for future generations of Andean people, so they would know who they were and what had been done to them. The tragic likelihood is that he was a brilliant man shouting into a hurricane, but the sheer defiant hope that drove him to try is what makes his work so profoundly moving. You can almost picture King Philip's secretary receiving this brick of a book and wondering if it's a very elaborate piece of fan mail or some kind of threat. Now, you get to see exactly what this good government he's pitching actually looks like.
You've seen the evidence, the devastating case Guaman Poma has built against the colonial regime. But a prosecutor who only lists crimes without offering a path to justice is just a storyteller. Poma is a man with a plan. You now enter the final and most audacious part of his manuscript, the Buen Gobierno, his detailed, page-by-page blueprint for fixing a broken world. This is not a list of vague suggestions. This is a complete operating manual for a new Indian kingdom, and he's submitting it to the king for approval. His central proposal is both radical and, in a strange way, deeply conservative. He doesn't call for the violent overthrow of the Spanish. He is far too pragmatic for that. Instead, he proposes a form of enlightened segregation. He envisions the viceroyalty of Peru being reorganized into two separate, parallel societies living under the single crown of Spain, a República de Españoles and a República de Indios. This is the mainstream historical fact that forms the core of his solution. The Spaniards would be confined to their cities, living by Spanish law and engaging in their own commerce. The Indians would live in their rural communities, governed by their own native lords according to their ancestral customs, all brought into harmony with Christian doctrine. The two republics would interact, but only through officially designated channels. It's the 17th century equivalent of a cosmic divorce, where the two parties agree to live in separate houses for the good of the children, with the king acting as the ultimate family court judge. At the very top of this new pyramid of power, of course, sits the King of Spain, God's chosen monarch. Poma is not challenging his ultimate sovereignty, but directly below the king in the Andes. The hierarchy would be re-established. The Republic of Indians would be governed by a descendant of the Inca royal line, who would act as a kind of Christian Sapa Inca, a prince serving the Spanish king. Below him, the old Inca administrative structure would be restored. The Curcas would once again govern there. Alas, and the decimal system of households would be used for organization. These native lords would be responsible for collecting a fair tribute for the king paid in goods, not forced labor, and for administering local justice. The abusive corregidors and greedy encomenderos would be gone, swept away. In their place would be a system run by Indians, for Indians, and this is where you see the sheer, breathtaking detail of his mind at work. A quirky and almost obsessive vision of social order. He doesn't just sketch out the political structure, he legislates every aspect of daily life. He reintroduces the Inca concept of the 10 ages of life, but he rebrands them for his new Christian world. He provides a job description for every single person at every stage of their life. From ages 5 to 9, boys should be helping their mothers and learning to trap birds. From 9 to 12, they should be guarding the family's livestock. A man of 33 is a soldier and warrior, ready to serve the king. A man over 80, a doting old man, is good only for eating and sleeping and telling stories, but he must be respected and fed by the community. He does the same for women, detailing their duties from weaving and cooking to raising children and, in their old age, raising guinea pigs and ducks. It's the most comprehensive social plan ever devised. A utopian vision that micromanages society down to the last duck. Guam and Poma is essentially auditioning to be the head of the universe, as most demanding homeowners association, but this is not simply a return to the Tawantin Suyu. This is a hybrid world, a synthesis of what he sees as the best of both civilizations. The social organization is Inca, but the moral and spiritual glue is Catholic. Everyone would be a devout Christian, churches would be respected, the sacraments would be honored, and the people would live according to the 10 Commandments. He is trying to create a society that has the structural integrity of the Inca Empire, but the soul of a true Christian kingdom. He believes that the Indian peoples, with their natural inclination towards order, discipline, and reverence, would make far better Christians than the greedy, hypocritical Spaniards who brought the faith to them. This grand, syncretic vision is the source of a profound historical debate. Historians still argue whether Guam and Poma's good government was a pragmatic and achievable proposal for colonial reform, or if it was a utopian, deeply nostalgic fantasy. Was he a forward-thinking political theorist imagining a new kind of commonwealth, or was he a heartbroken old man trying to reconstruct a world that was already gone, dressing it up in Christian clothes to make it palatable to the king? Was his plan a serious political document, or was it a form of literary therapy, a way of ordering the world on paper? Because he could no longer order it in reality, there is no easy answer. His proposal is filled with practical ideas for tax reform and administrative changes. But it is also a dream of a perfectly ordered, morally pure society that perhaps never truly existed, even under the Inca. He has written his manifesto. He has designed his perfect world. Now, all that is left is to send this monumental message in a bottle on its impossible journey across the sea.
The final word has been written. The last drop of ink has dried on the final drawing. The monumental task is complete. You watch as Guam and Poma, now a very old man, gathers the nearly 200 pages. He binds them himself, or perhaps has a trusted associate do it, into a single thick volume, a physical object that represents a third of his life. It is heavy in his hands, not just with the weight of the paper, but with the weight of all the hopes, the memories, and the sorrows it contains. Now comes the most perilous part of the entire endeavor: mailing it. Sometime around the year 1615, He entrusts his life's work to a person or a system he believes can get it to Spain. Perhaps he gives it to a sympathetic friar, or pays a ship's captain, or hands it to an official traveling back to the court. You can imagine the scene. An old man on a dusty road, handing over the most important thing in the world to a relative stranger, with no tracking number, no insurance, no guarantee of delivery. As the traveler disappears over the horizon, Guaman Poma is left with nothing but faith. And then, silence. The manuscript vanishes. It is as if he had thrown a stone into the deepest part of the ocean. There is no splash, no ripple, no response. The letter never arrives. Or if it does, it never reaches its intended recipient. You follow the ghostly journey of the book itself. It survives the treacherous overland trip to the port of Lima. It survives being loaded into the humid, rat-infested hold of a Spanish galleon. It survives the long, agonizing voyage across the Atlantic, evading pirates and storms. It arrives, against all odds, in a Spanish port, likely Seville, the gateway to the Indies. And it is there, in the vast, indifferent maw of the Spanish imperial bureaucracy, that it is swallowed whole. This is the mainstream historical fact that defines the next chapter of its life. For 300 years, the Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno was lost to the world. It was a message that had arrived at the post office but was never delivered. You can picture it being passed from one minor clerk to another. They would have opened it, seen the strange drawings, the peculiar Spanish mixed with Quechua, and simply not known what to do with it. It wasn't a standard tribute record. It wasn't a normal legal petition. It was a category of one. It likely got a cosmic return to sender stamp and was shoved onto a shelf in a forgotten archive, buried under an avalanche of more conventional paperwork. For 3 centuries, it sleeps. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, to whom it was addressed, dies out. The Bourbons take the throne. Revolutions sweep across Europe and the Americas. The Spanish Empire itself crumbles, and the nations of Peru and Bolivia are born from its ashes. The world is remade by steam power, electricity, and industrial warfare. And through all of it, the manuscript sits in darkness and silence, its desperate, urgent message unheard. It's a miracle it wasn't eaten by bookworms, destroyed in a fire, or simply thrown out during a spring cleaning. It could have ended its days as the world's most overqualified doorstop. Then, one day in 1908, the silence is broken. You are now in the hushed, scholarly atmosphere of the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen. A German academic named Richard Piechmann is working his way through the library's collection of manuscripts. He is a specialist in ancient languages, and he is likely looking for something else entirely. He requests a particular volume from the archives, cataloged simply as GKS 223242. A librarian brings him a large bound book. He opens it, and the world shifts. He is not looking at a standard European text. He is looking at a page filled with bold, expressive line drawings and a strange looping script. He sees a Sapa Inca. He sees a corrupt priest. He sees a world he has only read about in the polished, self-serving accounts of the Spanish chroniclers. And here, in his hands, is something raw, authentic, and utterly unique. A voice from the other side. You can feel his heart begin to pound, the thrill of discovery that is the dream of every historian. He has found it. Guaman Poma's message in a bottle has finally washed ashore. But how on earth did it get to Denmark? This is the quirky, almost unbelievable part of its journey. While the exact path is unknown, the most plausible theory is that a Danish ambassador to the Spanish court in the 1650s or 60s acquired the manuscript. He was likely a collector of oddities, and this strange illustrated book from the exotic Indies would have been a fascinating curiosity. He purchased it, took it back to Copenhagen, and eventually it was absorbed into the king's private collection, which later became the Royal Library. The book's very survival depended on it being treated not as an important legal document, which would have been filed and lost, but as a weird souvenir. This discovery immediately ignited a fierce debate. Historians still argue whether the manuscript was ever seriously reviewed by any Spanish official and deliberately suppressed, or if it was simply lost due to pure bureaucratic incompetence. Was its disappearance an act of malice, an effort to silence a dangerous dissenting voice? Or was it just a case of cosmic bad luck, a masterpiece falling through the cracks of a hopelessly inefficient system? The truth is, we will likely never know. What we do know is that thanks to Richard Peachman, Guaman Poma's voice, after 300 years of forced silence, was about to be heard for the first time. The longest letter ever written was finally about to be read.
The book lies open on a library table in Copenhagen, its pages yellowed and fragile. But the ink is as sharp and defiant as the day it was laid down, for 3 centuries. It was a silent object. Now it speaks, and its voice is a thunderclap that echoes back through history, shattering the carefully constructed narratives of the conquerors. You are no longer just an observer of a lost world. You are a recipient of its most important surviving testimony. The question now becomes, why? Why does this one, strange, long-lost book matter so much? The answer is simple: because of who is speaking. For centuries, our understanding of the Inca Empire and its fall was almost entirely shaped by 2 sources. The first was the Spanish themselves, the conquistadors, the priests, the bureaucrats. They wrote their own story, and unsurprisingly, they cast themselves as the heroes, brave Christian soldiers bringing civilization and salvation to a land of tyrants and heathens. The second source came from the descendants of the Inca royal elite in Cusco, men like Garcilaso de la Vega, who wrote beautiful, nostalgic histories of the empire. But their accounts, while invaluable, were also a form of propaganda, idealizing the Inca past to secure a privileged place for themselves within the new colonial order. They were insiders, writing from the center of power. Guaman Poma is neither. This is the mainstream historical fact that makes his work a document of world importance. The Nueva Crónica is the most comprehensive indigenous account of the Inca world and its destruction ever written, and it is written by a provincial outsider. He is not a Spaniard justifying the conquest, nor is he a Cuscoan royal lamenting the loss of his dynasty's power. He is a nobleman from a lesser, pre-Inca lineage, a man who saw both the Inca and the Spanish as foreign invaders in his ancestral homeland. This gives him a unique, critical perspective. He praises the order of the Inca state, but is careful to remind the reader that they were conquerors too. He is a Christian, but he is merciless in his critique of the colonial church. He is an advocate for his people, but he is also a grumpy, judgmental old man who complains about their moral failings. His voice is not the polished, official story. It is the complex, contradictory, and profoundly authentic voice of a man caught in the middle. A voice that, without this book, would be utterly lost to us. The sheer, encyclopedic scope of his work is breathtaking. He doesn't just tell you about kings and battles. He tells you everything. He gives you the names of the 12 months of the Inca calendar and the agricultural tasks associated with each. He draws and describes the different types of woven tunics worn in different provinces. He gives you a list of common diseases and their herbal remedies. He explains the proper way to conduct a wedding ceremony. This is a quirky and wonderful aspect of the text, its obsession with the mundane, the everyday. In one section, he includes a list of songs, complete with the mournful a refrain that should be sung during planting season. He's not just preserving a history. He is preserving a culture, a whole way of being in the world. He is the sole surviving librarian, archivist, and museum curator of a civilization on the brink of erasure. This incredible feat raises a crucial debate that continues to animate the study of his work. Historians still argue whether Guaman Poma should be read as a faithful ethnographic reporter accurately describing the Andean world as it was, or as a masterful polemicist who idealized the Inca past and exaggerated colonial abuses to strengthen his legal and moral argument. Is he a journalist or is he a lawyer? Is this book an encyclopedia or an indictment? The answer, of course, is that he is both. He certainly creates a rosier picture of the Inca past than was likely the reality, glossing over the brutality of their own conquests. He presents a world of perfect order to contrast it with the chaos of the present. But embedded within his argument is an ocean of priceless, factual detail that can be found nowhere else. To read Guaman Poma is to constantly navigate between his passion and his perception, between the world he wants you to see and the world he actually saw. Ultimately, the power of the Nueva Crónica comes from its singularity. It is a voice for the voiceless, the millions of Andean people who built the terraces, wove the textiles, and died in the silver mines of Potosi were mostly illiterate. They did not leave behind letters and diaries. Their joys and sorrows, their beliefs and their fears, vanished into the thin mountain air. Guaman Poma, in his magnificent, stubborn, and perhaps slightly crazy ambition, appointed himself their spokesman. He gathered up all their silent stories and wove them into a single, massive tapestry. He is not a king, a priest, or a general. He is just one man, armed with a pen, some paper, and an unshakable belief that the truth, if recorded with enough care and passion, could change the world. He failed. The letter never arrived, but 300 years later, his voice found its audience. It found us, and now, having heard his story and seen his world, you can take one final journey. Not just through his book, but with the man himself.
The library in Copenhagen fades away. The scent of old paper and dust is replaced by the sharp, clean smell of eucalyptus and cold stone. You are standing on a high pass in the Andes. The air is painfully thin, and the sky is a shade of blue so deep it feels like a solid thing. Beside you stands an old man. It is Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala. His work is done. His great letter is on its impossible journey to a king who will never see it. He is old now, stooped with the weariness of a man who has walked thousands of miles and carried the weight of a dying world on his shoulders. He has returned to his homeland, a prophet without honor, a lawyer who lost his own case. You begin to walk with him, not through the pages of his book, but through the land that fills them. You follow a faint path, a remnant of the once great Kapak Nyan. The paving stones are broken and scattered, a spine with its vertebrae displaced. As you walk, he points with a gnarled finger and his voice is raspy, worn thin by age and countless arguments in dusty courthouses. He doesn't just see the landscape in front of you. He sees all of its layers at once. He points to a series of crumbling terraces on a distant hillside. The land of the sun, he murmurs, more to himself than to you. There we grew the maize for the festivals. Now only weeds grow. You see a ruined stone wall. He sees a bustling tambo, where a fresh chasqui runner once waited, chewing coca leaves ready to sprint with a message for the Sapa Inca. The world he walks through is a ghost world, and he is its chief mourner. You pass a small village, a collection of adobe huts clustered around a whitewashed Spanish church. A bell tolls, its metallic clang an alien sound in this ancient landscape. He looks at it with a complex expression. He is a devout Christian, but he sees the church as both a house of God and a house of suffering. He sees the fat priest inside, living off the forced labor of his flock. He sees the children with their new Spanish names, forgetting the Quechua words for the mountains that surround them. He is a man who tried to build a bridge between two worlds, only to find himself stranded in the middle of a chasm. As you walk, you notice the silence. The land feels empty. This is the final devastating mainstream historical fact that underscores his entire project: the catastrophic demographic collapse of the Andean population. Within a century of the conquest, diseases like smallpox and measles, combined with the brutal exploitation of the mines and encomiendas, had wiped out as much as 80 or 90% of the people. The Tawantinsuyu had not just been conquered, it had been hollowed out. The villages are smaller, the fields are fallow, and the roads are quiet. Guaman Poma meticulously documented this in his manuscript, comparing the census figures of the Inca with the grim reality of the colonial present. His work is not just a history, it's an obituary for millions. He pauses for a moment, leaning on a simple wooden staff. He adjusts the slightly too formal Spanish ruff he wears around his neck, a gesture that seems both proud and pathetic. This is a quirky, personal tidbit you notice about him. He insists on this piece of European attire, this symbol of a gentleman, even here, in the middle of nowhere, on a forgotten mountain path. It is his uniform, the armor of a man who fought the colonial system not with a weapon, but with its own language of law and status. He never stopped believing he was a nobleman, a lord of the land, equal to any Spaniard. The ruff is a small, stubborn declaration of a dignity they could not take from him. His journey is almost over. He has done all he can. He has written it all down. He has given his testimony to God and to a king who would never listen. Historians still argue how we should remember him. Was he a tragic, quixotic figure? A man whose life's work was a magnificent failure? Or was he one of the most brilliant and resilient indigenous intellectuals in history? A man who forged a new way of fighting, a new way of seeing, from the wreckage of his world. Was he a voice for his people? or a profoundly ambitious man trying to reclaim his own family's lost glory. Perhaps, like the hybrid world he tried to build, he was all these things at once. He looks out across the valley, at the peaks that have witnessed everything, from the first age of man to this broken present. You expect to see despair in his eyes, but instead you see a flicker of something else. It is the fierce, stubborn hope of a man who believes, against all evidence, that justice is a force of nature, like the sun that will rise tomorrow. He believes that the truth once spoken can never be truly silenced. And after 300 years in a dark library an ocean away, he was proven right. The sun is beginning to set now, casting long, deep purple shadows across the valley. The sharp edges of the mountains soften into silhouettes against a sky ablaze with the final colors of the day. The air grows colder, and a profound stillness settles over the high peaks. Your journey with the old chronicler is at an end. You can let the image of him fade. A lonely, defiant figure on a high Andean pass, his work finally done. The story is told. The great complaint has been filed with the universe, and you have been its witness. And now, you can feel the weight of this history begin to lift, leaving behind only the quiet echo of his voice and the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let the silence of the Andes fill the space around you, a silence that has absorbed so much and endured for so long. There are no more drawings to decode, no more injustices to catalog. There is only this moment of peace at the top of the world. As the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, the wind whispers a final ancient story through the ichu grass, a lullaby for a world that sleeps and dreams of what was and what might yet be. It is time for you, too, to rest.